You may be aware that America has accumulated quite a few invasive species over the years. In this video, I plan to tell you about some that you may not know are invasive species. This is the most quirked up invasive species in America. So let's get this started. I want to start out with an honorable mention for possibly the least quirked up animal on this list. This is the obscure mealybug. It's this little loser-ass bug that no one even noticed till the 1900s. We think it might be from South America. And its main thing is it just likes to eat grapes. I can't blame it. I do really just love the thought of, like, naming a animal obscure, though. Like, oh, I don't know, it's weird, it's in the grass, it's kind of obscure, fuck it, that's its name. For our next animal, we're going on down to America's foot-long dingle-dong, Florida. Florida is well known for its invasive species, but here's one you don't know. Herpes monkeys. It is believed that there are currently 3 species of invasive monkeys in Florida. They are the rhesus macaque, the vervet monkey, and the squirrel monkey. The main one we're going to be talking about is also the most common, is the rhesus macaque. It is believed that the bulk of the macaques in Florida currently descend from a group that was introduced by a man named Colonel Toohey, who was a jungle boat captain in Florida, and he put out some monkeys to get people more excited for his tours. Some of the macaques may have also come from research facilities and zoos that were destroyed by hurricanes such as Hurricane Andrew. Most of these live in and around the Silver Springs State Park. You may be thinking, oh, what's the big deal? Monkeys are cute. The issue is that out of the 1,000 that they've caught of these, almost all of them have had herpes B virus, which is a deadly version of herpes when humans catch it, but they carry it asymptomatically. Colonies of these can also be found in South Carolina and Puerto Rico, where they've been able to do a lot of environmental damage by eating birds' eggs and destroying crops. The other 2 main monkey species in Florida are the vervet monkey and the squirrel monkey, which really hasn't been able to maintain a solid population due to them not doing very well in winter weather. And the vervet monkeys have a relatively stable population of around 40 members in different little colonies. Next up, we're going on down to Texas to get a little Hakuna Matata-y, because Texas currently has an infestation of warthogs. That's right, the Chaparral Wildlife Management Area has had some little warthogs hanging around. They're even reproducing, as you can see here. We got one with 4 little piglets. A fun thing about warthogs I didn't know is these things live in burrows, so they're even harder to spot than a normal pig. Thankfully, it's believed that they can't interbreed with the feral hogs that are already in Texas, which is good, because the last thing you need is 30 to 50 feral warthogs going through your property. The positive note on the efforts to try and contain these is they taste good, and because they're an exotic species, there's no hunting regulations on them. So hopefully this situation will work out. Now get ready to squirm, because our next one up is a worm. It's the Amynthus. It's a worm that's native to East Asia, such as Taiwan. It's about 2 inches to 8 inches long, and it's also known as the crazy worm, because it jumps around like this. The main issue with these is earthworms in total are not really native to America. Even the normal common earthworm you think of is actually from Europe. And a big issue is that they're changing the way our soil is, which is hurting native trees. These crazy worms are breeding really fast, and it could speed up the issues of the soil changing. Our next section I'm just going to call the whole ass fish store. The big issue is that people take home a fish and then it gets too big for their tank and they're like, oh, I don't know what to do with it. So they throw it in the river, which just is causing a whole ton of issues throughout the country at this point. We got plecostomuses digging holes in levees in places like Houston. The other big issue is that there's these fish that are being released that they just outcompete the native fish, such as Oscars, snakeheads, jewelfish, a lot of other cichlids, and also the lionfish, which is just destroying the area around Florida. There's also this weird-ass lake in Colorado now that's just filled with goldfish. Bottom line is, if you get a fish and you don't know how to take care of it, take it back to the store. Stop being a fucking dumbass. Next up, we got parrots. There are believed to be 25 species of parrots in the US that have breeding colonies, and they're all invasive. At one point, the US did have 2 breeding species of parrots. There was the Carolina parakeet, which was wiped out in the early 20th century by a breakout of Newcastle disease. And there was the thick-billed parrot, which was pushed out due to habitat loss, but it still lives in Mexico. A study from 2002 to 2016 found that about 60% of the parrot sightings were of either the monk parakeet, the red-crowned Amazon, or the Nandi parakeet. Really, there is a little bit of a moral issue that wildlife conservationists are going through with these, because some of these species are endangered in their home country, but they're flourishing out here where they don't have the same predators, and where people aren't trying to sell them into the pet trade. The states where they're most common are like Florida, Texas, California, the kind of sun states. But there is also active populations in places like Chicago and New York. I'm not going to go over all the invasive species in this country. There are a lot more. And I don't think they're all quirky enough to be on this list. Like even this rat that's dancing isn't quite quirky enough. But I hope you have a great day. Have you ever been so hungry you could eat a horse? Well, that would be better than eating any of this stuff, because this stuff will kill you. That's right, today we're talking about toxic meat. First up, we have several species of poisonous birds that live in Papua New Guinea. There are several species of shrike thrush, several species of pitui, and the blue-capped ifrit. You may be wondering why these birds are toxic. Well, it's not because they play League of Legends, it's because there's a beetle in their area called the chorcine beetle. These beetles and these birds all contain what is called batrachotoxin. This toxin is actually very similar to what is found in some poison dart frogs in South America. It seems that over time, not only have these birds built up an immunity to this toxin, they've actually developed little glands in their skin to hold it, which then rubs off on their skin and their feathers. The toxin is found in other parts of the body as well, just in lower amounts. I got 2 fun facts to go with these little guys. The first one of these birds that was noticed to be poisonous was the hooded pitui. It was discovered that they're poisonous because some museum caretakers were getting some skins and feathers ready to be displayed, and their hands went numb and started burning. That was probably an exciting day in the museum. I never saw Ben Stiller have to deal with that. The second fun fact is that there's no known antidote to the toxin in these guys. But there is a proposed countermeasure that is very strange. See, the batrachotoxin affects how your body handles sodium. And a proposed theory I found is that the toxin in pufferfish and the toxin in red tide both affect sodium channels in the opposite way. So in theory, they could counteract each other, but it would be kind of insane to do. It's kind of on the same level of thinking as the fact that you could technically cure syphilis by giving someone malaria. Next up, things are going to get a little fishy, because we're talking about ciguatera fish poisoning. The way this one happens is that there's a certain kind of algae, also known as a dinoflagellate, that lives in reefs. This algae produces a chemical that is mostly harmless to fish called ciguatoxin. Our toxic algae then mixes in with other kinds of algae and accidentally gets eaten by herbivore fish, which is still at low levels because they don't eat a ton of it, but the issue is that then the predators eat the herbivore fish and their toxicity keeps getting higher and higher. Some fish that can be dangerous to eat because of this are like moray eels, groupers, barracuda, and red snapper. Because it's pretty likely for this to happen in small fishing areas. It's hard to nail down a real number on how many people get this each year, but it's probably somewhere between 50,000 and 500,000. It usually starts with normal things like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, but then it moves on to the strange neurological issues. These can range from numbness in like the lips and extremities, vertigo, little muscle twitches, and my favorite, the reversal of the sensation of hot and cold. It can also cause chronic pain, hallucinations, and heart issues. Symptoms can last anywhere from a few weeks to 20 years, and because of this, it's sometimes misdiagnosed as multiple sclerosis. Dying from this isn't super common, it's only about 1 in 1,000 cases, but it still doesn't sound fun, so I would avoid it. So the moral of this story is that just because moray eels are a similar color to key lime pie doesn't mean they're as good. Next up, these two might not be my first choice of things to eat, but they are interesting. It's the garter snake and the California newt. Can you guess where the California newt lives? That's right, California. Even though California newts kind of look like they would be chamoy and orange flavored, they're actually death flavored. See, these guys are filled with tetrodotoxin, which is the same toxin that's in pufferfish. The California newt and its cousin, the rough-skinned newt, are locked in an arms race with the garter snake. This arms race is so terrifying that it's only been rivaled by that of the USSR and the United States. See, what has happened is the garter snake is continuously evolving to be able to eat these newts. And then these newts evolve stronger toxin to scare off the garter snake, which then the garter snake just evolves for that. It's really just gotten out of control at this point. There's a famous story where some cops showed up at a campsite because everyone there had died, and they realized it was because a newt got in the coffee pot. And because now the newts are so toxic, and when the garter snake eats them, they actually build up toxin in themselves, so they're now also toxic. And it's just a mess. Dang liberal newts. Our last two are a little quirky. They're not poisonous like those other meats we talked about. They're a little different. First up, we got what's called protein poisoning, and no, it's not what happens when you try to eat like The Rock. The way that this one works is that if you eat only very lean meat, eventually your body will run out of fats and carbs to keep running. So essentially you will die of malnutrition even though your stomach is constantly full of meat. The animal most associated with this phenomenon is the rabbit. This can happen to people who are in kind of a wilderness area like lumberjacks, survivalists, soldiers, very easily because rabbits are often very plentiful because they breed like rabbits. Rabbits also tend to be much leaner than other meats you would normally eat. Rabbit has about 2 grams of fat per 100 grams of meat, where say a chicken wing has 8 grams of fat per 100 grams of meat. Symptoms will start a few weeks after you switch your diet to this. It'll start with nausea, fatigue, eventually vomiting, and then eventually death. We even have a record of this happening to the Romans in 150 BC. So if your friend tells you to try out this new all-rabbit diet, maybe keep an eye on them. Last up, we have what is called hypervitaminosis A. As the name suggests, this is when you have Too much vitamin A. The symptoms start with kind of normal things like dizziness, headache, nausea, but if you continue to hit too much of that A, your skin will peel off and your bones will crumble. You can get this from getting too many vitamin A supplements, but the main way people do this is through liver. One source that is kind of bold is called liver oil. It's very high in vitamin A. Do not drink a gallon of it. The main source for recorded issues for this, though, is when people try to eat the liver of Arctic animals. This is because vitamin A is fat soluble, and these Arctic animals have a lot of fat to stay warm, and it just kind of builds up. This includes polar bears, seals, moose, walruses, and even huskies. 500 grams of polar bear liver is enough to kill an adult human, which is a little over a pound. It's also thought that because of its vitamin A content, about 100 grams of husky liver would kill you. The cure for this is to stop eating so much vitamin A, and that's about it. Another fun fact is that this isn't actually possible to get from fruits or vegetables because the beta-carotene, which is the normal source of vitamin A in those things, is processed differently. So as you go through the rest of your day, just be careful, because if you eat the wrong meat, you might be dead meat. Asbestos. If you were born before the 80s, you know about asbestos because it was everywhere. If you were born later than that, you know about it because if you or a loved one was exposed to it and have mesothelioma, you should call a lawyer. Today I'm going to tell you what it is, what it does, what its history is, and what its present is. Let's start off with what asbestos actually is. I wouldn't blame you if you thought asbestos was some sort of crazy man-made chemical, but it's actually a readily available mineral. It's just in the ground. Asbestos is what's called a silicate, meaning it's made of silicon and oxygen. Some other silicates you might have heard of are sand, cement, technically glass, and talc. You might have actually seen talc in the news recently because there's been a lot of lawsuits regarding baby powder causing cancer. The reason for this is talc and asbestos often occur together, and it's very hard to keep the asbestos out of the talcum powder. What makes asbestos differ from these other silicates, though, is the form it takes. See, instead of being a little round thing like sand, it comes out in a shape that reminds me of the natural socks that hobbits come with. There are 6 main kinds of asbestos: chrysotile, actinolite, amosite, anthophyllite, crocidolite, and tremolite. Chrysotile is the most common asbestos in the US. About 90% of what is found in buildings is chrysotile. It's also known as white asbestos. Crocidolite, also known as blue asbestos, was very commonly used as well. It's very common in Australia. In fact, Australia has its own Chernobyl called Wittenoom, and it's because of asbestos. Wittenoom was a pretty large asbestos mining operation because it has a lot of it just naturally in the ground there. In fact, in the area, you can often see just blue patches of ground or stones, and it's just asbestos. In 2022, the last resident of Wittenoom was evicted by the government. The area is now covered in warning signs warning about the dangers of the asbestos, but apparently you can still often find people sneaking into it to take pictures for Instagram. Asbestos isn't toxic in the same way as like rattlesnake poison, cyanide, Rainbow Six Siege lobbies, or anything like that. The danger in asbestos is that the little fibers can break off and then they'll go in your lungs, and then the fibers wedge themselves into the tissue of your lungs. And because they're essentially glass, they never decompose, they just stay in there like they pay rent. We're not sure the exact way they cause cancer, but there are 3 leading theories. The first theory is that the fibers are actually small enough that they can go in and actually damage the individual strands of DNA, just by stabbing it. Then this damaged DNA replicates itself and becomes cancer. The second theory is that these fibers somehow become a catalyst to create what are called reactive oxygen species. These are oxygen-based chemicals that can cause various kinds of DNA damage, which can lead to cancer. The most common of these is peroxide. The last theory is that as the fibers sit in your lungs, they're constantly causing damage. They're just tearing up your lungs like those coconut crabs tore up Amelia Earhart. And as this constantly causes cell destruction and inflammation over time, it increases the chance of a cancerous cell being created. People have been making stuff out of asbestos about as long as they've been making stuff. In fact, we have found clay pots with asbestos in them that were finished in Finland 4,500 years ago. Having asbestos in the pots would have been useful because the asbestos fibers kind of hold the ceramic together and make it stronger. We do something similar to this in modern times. We put fiberglass around brick buildings to keep it from falling over in earthquakes. Asbestos cloth was used by many ancient civilizations. We have accounts of it being used in Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, Persia, and India. It had a couple main uses back then. An interesting use for it was often used in temples and tombs because they would put it in the wicks of the lanterns and then they could just keep filling it with oil and the wick would never die. It was also used for like fancy ceremonial dress or like the good tablecloths that a king would have. A lot of these kings, including Charlemagne, would wait for the tablecloths and napkins to get dirty at official functions and then throw them in the fire and like freak everyone out and then pull them out and they're clean. Maybe Charlemagne continuously showing his guests how cool it is to burn things is part of why the people who now live in his former empire just love burning things in the streets. Another interesting use for this asbestos cloth is that they would put kings inside asbestos funeral shrouds and then cremate them, and it would keep the king's ashes ashes in the shroud away from the wood ash. If you want to experience something similar at home, take a banana still in its peel and make a slit in it, kind of like a hot dog bun. Then you can stuff that slit with like chocolate, marshmallows, nuts, and candy. Then wrap the entire banana in aluminum foil, and then you could put it next to like a campfire or on the grill or in the oven until it gets all warm and gooey inside. And then you have a banana boat, which is a lovely dessert, and when you eat it, you can think about eating a dead king. Famed pool game inventor Marco Polo also gave accounts of seeing asbestos mines in his travels in Asia. The interesting thing is that at this time it was already known that asbestos wasn't necessarily good to breathe in. We don't have the actual source material, but we do think either Pliny the Elder or Pliny the Younger described the fact that the asbestos miners in the empire would get lung issues. Apparently we don't know which one said this though, because we just have it referenced in other books from near the time, but we don't have the original book. Asbestos didn't really hit its heyday though till the Industrial Revolution. Asbestos became a very big deal at this time, partially because mining equipment was created that allowed it to be extracted quicker, and also the fact that big factories became a thing and their equipment needed fireproof insulation. This led to asbestos becoming very big business. This led to the creation of huge asbestos mines in different places in the world, including Italy, Quebec, Staten Island, South Africa, and the before mentioned Australia. Asbestos ended up being used in quite a few things. Some you could probably name off the top of your head, some are a little weirder. Some of the things you might guess is it was used in things like floor tile, it was used in fireproof doors, it was used in the fire suits that like firemen and race car drivers use. It was used to make the curtains at theaters because there's a lot of issues with those catching on fire and killing everyone in the building. Also famously, asbestos was used in brake pads until quite recently. It was also used in some things you wouldn't think of, like making dental casts, or filtering wine, or making gas mask filters. Also famously, there was a company called Kent that had their Micronite line of cigarettes. These were cigarettes that their filter was filled with blue asbestos and crepe paper. In the world of RPGs, this is called stacking debuffs. A big building material that this was used for a lot was they would mix the asbestos with concrete and use it to make like panels for the outsides of houses. The trade name for this product was Fibrolite, which kind of sounds like it'd make you poop better. These were used a lot, especially post-World War II, in places where they needed to rebuild buildings quickly. You can actually still find some of these little temporary houses in parts of Europe, especially England, that they made and they don't really know what to do with now because they're made of asbestos. Another place it was common was in Australia, and Queensland actually has a special law that you cannot pressure wash these houses because it'll spread the asbestos.
What the fuck is going on in here on this day?
Asbestos started to be banned or at least heavily regulated in the 80s and 90s by most countries. Currently, 66 countries have complete bans on asbestos. The EPA tried to completely ban asbestos in the US in 1991 with the Asbestos Ban and Phase Out rule. Unfortunately, a complete ban was struck down by the courts in the ruling Corrosion-Proof Fittings versus the Environmental Protection Agency. They were able to ban it in the use of corrugated paper, rolled board, commercial paper, specialty paper, and flooring felt. They were also able to ban any new use of asbestos. The Clean Air Act also banned asbestos pipe insulation, asbestos block insulation on components like boilers, water tanks, and spray-applied surfacing asbestos-containing materials. The Consumer Product Safety Act bans asbestos in artificial fireplace embers and wall patching compounds. Also, the FDA has largely gotten asbestos out of pharmaceuticals and food. The most common uses for asbestos in the US today are automobile clutches, brake pads, corrugated sheeting, imported cement pipe, and roofing materials and vinyl tile still. There are a few countries that still heavily mine asbestos. 53% of new asbestos mined is mined in Russia, followed by Kazakhstan with 16%, China with 15%, and Brazil with 11.5%. About 70% of actual products being made out of asbestos are made in Asia, the largest producers being China, India, and Indonesia. At this point you may be wondering, well, what do we do with all this asbestos? In most places, asbestos is dealt with by just kind of putting it in containers that are airtight, and then burying it in special landfills that are marked off that it has this. There are actually, though, a few ways to permanently dispose of asbestos by turning it into other things. If you remember from the beginning of the video, asbestos is just a kind of silica. So there's a few ways that we can melt it down so that it is no longer in fibrous form, so that it is not dangerous. If you get it above about 1000 Celsius or 1800 Fahrenheit, it'll just kind of melt into other kinds of silica. And if you get it above 1250 Celsius or 2300 Fahrenheit, it'll become a silicate glass. Also, if you take some asbestos and fire very strong microwaves at it, you can turn it into various kinds of ceramic and porcelain. Also, if you put it in oxalic acid and hit it with some ultrasounds, it'll just kind of dissolve. So if you find something made out of asbestos, the best thing you do is, in the US you can call the EPA, in other countries I'm sure you have something similar, and they will be able to instruct you on how best to get rid of it. Try to not move it and don't let anything scrape it because you don't want those fibers getting into the air. I hope you found this informative and entertaining, and just remember, asbestos is not the bestest. Cryptids are animals that are popularly believed to exist, but science has never found any proof of them. They can also be thought of as urban legends or modern mythical creatures. They range from the very well-known ones, like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, all the way to what we're talking about today. First up, we're talking about an underwater cryptid. Usually I give stories about underwater monsters a bit more credibility because there's so many strange underwater creatures out there. For instance, the giant squid was thought of as a cryptid for a long time, but it turns out they're perfectly real, and we have video of them. I do not, however, lend a lot of credibility to the Oklahoma octopus. That's right, there's a contingent of people that think there are octopuses living in man-made lakes in Oklahoma. It's described as being kind of a reddish-brown and about the size of a horse, which is very large for cephalopod. This would also be unusual because there are no known freshwater octopuses. Part of the reasoning of this creature existing is that a lot of people drown in Oklahoma's man-made lakes, but the much more likely explanation than a giant octopus is that Sooners like to drink. I also feel like due to the popularity of catfish noodling in Oklahoma, if these things existed, we would have evidence of it by now. Obviously, I don't find this creature very likely. I think the strongest suckers in Oklahoma are the lot lizards down at the Flying J. Our next cryptid contender may have one of the coolest names I've ever heard, but it's kinda lame. It's the Mongolian death worm. In Mongolian, it's also known as the Olgoi Korokoi, which means the large intestine worm. You may be thinking I'm being kinda harsh on the Mongolian death worm, but it's a lot less exciting once you learn what it's actually supposed to be. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine the giant sandworms from Dune, except it's 2 feet long and red. The dang thing looks like you could buy it at a Phillies game. In the folklore, supposedly if you touch it, you will die, but I don't know why you would. Supposedly, it can also shoot poison and or electricity. Believers seem split on this. In the 1980s, some scientists caught an animal and they brought it to some locals who said they'd seen the death worm before, and they confirmed it was the same animal. The thing is that the animal they brought before them was the Tartar sand boa. These snakes are fat little guys that only grow up to be about 4 foot long. They're not poisonous, although they do look like the most shady snake I've ever seen. They kind of look like they're going to sell me crypto. There are also legless lizards in the area that might have served as inspiration for this story. Also, in case you're wondering, Frank Herbert says he didn't know about these things when he wrote Dune. He was kind of basing it off the sandworms that live in the Pacific Northwest where he's from. In the end, after looking into this legend, I do not think the Mongolian death worm is the most worrisome worm I've heard about. I still think it's Dennis Rodman. Next up, we have a cryptid that's a bit more modern and urban. It is the world's Stanky Lake champion. It is the Fresno Nightcrawler.
What the fuck is going on in here on this day?
The Fresno Nightcrawler is a creature that's about 7 feet tall, it's gray, and it kind of looks like one of those leaf bags that looks like a ghost got up and walked away. These big old funky dudes started showing up around 2010 around Fresno and Yosemite National Park. There have also been claimed sightings of these things in Billings, Montana, Ohio, and for some reason Poland. Early on, these things were claimed to be part of Native American folklore in the area, but the actual Native Americans in the area have shot this down. None of the stories of these things make it seem like they're a threat or anything. They just kind of walk around, and my theory for what they are is that John Cleese just likes to travel. Well, I'm 100% sure that all of the sightings of this thing are a hoax. I do think it's really fun. I like watching it walk around, and it's really silly, and I wish it was real. Mr. Nightcrawler, if you are watching this, I hope you walk your way over to Balenciaga because they will definitely hire you. Our next creature sounds like you'd catch it hanging out at the Abbey in LA, but it's actually from Ireland. It's the king otter, also known as Dovarku. Dovarku. It's basically a large 15-foot long otter-dog hybrid. They're mostly associated with living in County Leitrim in Ireland. In fact, in Conwall Cemetery in County Leitrim, there is a headstone of a woman who died in the 18th century that depicts the Dovarku, the local legend being that she was killed by it. The legend is that in the 1700s, a lady went down to the Glendale Loch to wash some clothes, and when her husband went to check on her, she had done got ate. Apparently the monster was still there sleeping on top of her corpse. Her husband ran home, grabbed a knife, came back, and killed the and its death cries brought forth its mate out of the water as the second phase of the boss battle. Soon other locals hearing the cries came forth to help the man fend off this foul beast, and they managed to put down Dovarku to Electric Boogaloo. I don't think this one's very likely either, largely because Ireland's a fairly populated place, and something that big would be seen. I also don't know what it'd eat. There's not a lot of large animals left in Ireland since the death of the Irish elk. I do think this would be a terrifying animal though. Otters are kind of scary anyways. If you've ever seen the Amazon River otters, they're like little water wolves, and you oughter not mess with them. And now we're going to talk about the Frank Reynolds of snakes, the Tsuchinoko. The Tsuchinoko is a magical snake that comes to us from Japan. They're supposed to be like 12 to 31 inches long, and they're unique because their body is fatter than their head and their tail. In other words, they kind of look like a Tootsie Roll. There are a few things that are interesting about these little chode snakes. First, they can talk, but they mostly lie and try to trick you. 2, they love alcohol. They will try to get it at any cost. A lot of you are probably thinking that this snake sounds like your ex. And lastly, these little guys like to get around by taking their tail, putting it in their mouth, and rolling like a wheel. They can also apparently jump up to a meter into the air. On top of this, they can also double jump, apparently. Every year on May 3rd in the Gifu Prefecture, they actually have the Tsuchinoko Festival, which is where everyone gets together and they go and try and find one. If you get one, you get 1.28 million yen. Another interesting thing about these guys is they apparently have a different name in just about every prefecture in Japan. Also, apparently the Pokemon Dunsparce is loosely based on these little critters. Sightings of these little guys has apparently gone up drastically in the last few decades because a lot of books and media have been using them in Japan, and it's just kind of caught on like wildfire. I think it's safe to say that these guys are not real because otherwise they would be world leaders by now. The last thing we'll be covering today is a bit more of a broad subject. We're going to be talking about cyanocephali. Cyanocephali simply means doghead. It's kind of used as a catch-all term for the fact that in ancient history, all over the world, there's a lot of accounts of people that just have dog heads. Obviously, the best known of these is Omnibus, but there's a lot more out there. For instance, in the Coptic Church, there's the tale of Saint Arrakis and Saint Algani, who are both depicted as having dog heads. Also in the Eastern Orthodox Church, many of the depictions of Saint Christopher show him as having a dog head. There's a few versions of his story that have him with a dog head, but it's usually along the lines of he's a mercenary, he fights for the Romans and other people, and eventually he meets Jesus and he gets baptized and he loses his dog head. There's more stories of these dog-headed people ranging from ancient Egypt to Rome to Greece to Russia to China to India. They're really all over the place. Also, an important distinction is a lot of these stories do talk about like actually talking to these people that have the dog heads and like doing business with them and everything. They're not just some weird beast out in the woods like Sasquatch. We have cyanocephali accounts coming to us from everyone from Herodotus to Marco Polo to Christopher Columbus. Although those three aren't really trustworthy, it is interesting that it spanned that long a time. Apparently Cortez even got instructions to look for them while he was conquering the Aztecs. Now a lot of these could just be completely made up stories, or they could be some sort of like joke we don't get, kind of like the snails that get written in medieval texts. But I think there's a possibility that these and some other mythical creatures have a grain of truth to them. And I have a theory I want to share with you. I want you to think of it this way. If your grandmother came to you and said, there's a dog-headed man in the grocery store, would you think there's a supernatural creature, or would you think there's something like this? I think that a lot of mythical creatures, such as the cyanocephali, werewolves, skinwalkers, wendigos, anything else you can think of that's like an animal-human thing, it could just be a furry. And before you come at me with like, furries are a modern thing, I want you to think about this. There's berserkers and many other warriors from back then that they would wear animal skins because they said it made them feel more like the animal. If a dude came up to you at the YMCA wearing an animal skin because it made him feel like a bear, you would call him a furry. Something to keep in mind when you're looking at historical accounts is that we haven't really changed as a species since the rise of civilization. Cultural norms have changed and we've gained knowledge, but generally we have the same physiology and psychology that we've always had. And think about some of the other ones like skinwalkers and werewolves. Imagine someone's out in the woods furrying it up, they're in their animal skin, and then someone sees them and they stand up and look at them, and either they run at them because they don't want them to tell their secret, or they run away. Either way, that person is scared shitless and tells them they saw a wolf man. So think about it with the cyanocephali. These people are just wearing dog heads because they like it, and they're good at their jobs. Like St. Christopher was apparently a great warrior. Imagine you had the best warrior in the world, but he wore his dog head all the time. You're like, okay, well, whatever, I guess. We'll deal with it. It's kind of like how Atari had to deal with Steve Jobs' awful farts when he worked there because he kept doing weird like fruit and veggie diets. I call this a unified furry theory, and I think that a large portion of animal-human hybrid kind of things that you see in history were just people seeing furries. So in summation, I think it is possible that St. Christopher was the sonic fox of early Christianity. You clicked on this video because you're a little weird and you want some weird knowledge, so let's get right to it. We're going from least cursed to most cursed, so let's hop into a kiddie pool full of our first contender. Something I've learned recently is that a surprising number of people do not know what gelatin is made out of. If you are one of these people, I'm here to enlighten you. See, good old Mormon nip is actually a compound that comes from collagen, and we get it by boiling the parts of the animal we don't eat, such as the bones and hooves. If you ever pulled your mother's pork chop out of the fridge and had some clear gooey stuff on top, that is gelatin. Hopefully. I'm going to throw in a jello shot of gelatin trivia to go with this. Gelatin has been used in cooking for hundreds of years in many horrifying ways, all the way from spaghetti-o jello in the 70s in the US, to holodets in Eastern Europe, all the way to a curry-based gelatin made in northern Thailand that I couldn't find a proper pronunciation guide for, but I wanted to mention it. I believe it's called Gaang Gradong, ? The first patent for instant gelatin was made by a man named Peter Cooper, who also made the first steam engine in America and bold follicle choices. It gets weirder the more you look at it. This man's keratin formations are downright Lovecraftian. Lovecraftian. That said, gelatin isn't actually bad for you or anything. It's actually pretty nutritious as far as desserts go. It's actually full of stuff that helps your skin, your hair, and your joints. Eat enough gelatin and you too can have a lustrous coat like the golden retriever on the dog food bag. Next up, we're going to be talking about slurping down some sweet, sweet red, so let's get ready. Next up, we're going to talk about one of the most common food dyes in the world. It's called carmine, aka cochineal, aka crimson lake, aka red natural 4, aka E120, aka crush up cactus bug. Carmine has been used by Native Americans for over 1,000 years, and it's been used by the rest of the world since the 1500s. Carmine is used in a wide range of products. One of the most common uses for carmine is in cosmetics. In fact, the bright red color that you associate with like early Hollywood, like Marilyn Monroe, that's carmine. Nothing says glamour quite like a bit of bug goo on your lips. It's also been used in everything from clothes dyeing to painting to a lot of your food. It's made by taking the cochineal scale insect, you crush it up into a powder, and you boil it in a base like ammonia, and then you use alum to take the red out of the solution. Luckily, no one ever told Joseph McCarthy about alum. The interesting thing about all this is, as icky as it sounds, carmine is actually one of the safer dyes we eat. After all, titanium dioxide, red 40, yellow 6, and yellow 5 are all commonly used, but known to be linked to several health conditions. On the other hand, the main health concern for carmine is that some people are allergic to it, and new synthesized versions of it seem to get rid of that issue. That makes it a downright health food compared to brominated vegetable oil, which was found in Mountain Dew till recently. It can cause severe memory loss and other brain damage, but if you still want that since it's been taken out, you can just buy Mountain Dew Throwback, which still has it in it. So next time you're walking past a cactus and see some weird white shit on it, maybe thank it for not being as bad for you as a lot of the other things you eat. Next up, we're going to talk about some hidden protein that might have been helping out your macros. We're about to talk about the fun and exciting world of allowable contamination in your food. See, an inescapable truth about the food we eat is that it comes from outside. That means that it comes in contact with other things that are outside. And oftentimes those things are still contacting it when it's in your mouth. See, the FDA has a whole set of rules called Food Defect Action Levels. This is a whole list of very specific amounts of insects and other contaminants are allowed in your food in the US. Some examples are up to 925 insect fragments per 10 grams of thyme. Or you can have 20 whole insects in a 100-pound bag of peanuts. Or my favorite, you can have 2,500 aphids in 10 grams of hops. The idea behind these rules is that when you're operating a scale, it's hard to keep all the little bugs out. It's kind of like how at large gatherings like sports venues or conventions, it's hard to keep out undesirable people, like people who play World of Warcraft. Also, I see my EU frog sitting there giggling, but I have some news for you as well. See, the EU does not have a table like this. They don't have an equivalent. But that doesn't mean what people think it means. Not having a limit does not mean the same thing as none of it is allowed. I've even seen some English news agencies get this wrong, so let's go through what that actually means. The way EU law is written is that the bug parts do not have a set limit. What it goes down to is whether or not the inspector thinks it's hygienic. The fact that this is left up to interpretation is slightly worrying, even though EU generally has better food safety than the US. There might be some internal guidelines that I don't have access to, but as far as the law goes, it's really just up to whoever the inspector is that day. This means it's entirely possible that there are factories in the EU that are being regulated much harsher than the US, but there are others that might be more lenient, which is kind of odd. The good news is you've been eating it your whole life and you're still here. Next up, we're going to talk about Chuck Berry's favorite subject. This next subject is just kind of a basic truth of our lives. Everything you eat and everything you own has been urinated on at some point. You may be wondering who has urinated on my things, and the answer is me and my crew. See, pretty much everything that you interact with on a daily basis has at some point been in a warehouse. And due to the nature of warehouses, they often have their doors open and they're usually in less populated parts of town. That means that it doesn't really matter how much pest control these warehouses try to do. There's a good chance at any given moment there's going to be some sort of pest in it. Could be rats, could be mice, could be cockroaches, could be just about anything, honestly. The rats yearn for the warehouse, much like the children yearn for the mines. I actually used to have a coworker who worked at a Coca-Cola factory, and he talked about that he always put his cans in the dishwasher before drinking out of them because of what he'd seen. Again, this is something totally out of your control. You can do nothing about it. You didn't even know about it till just now. But it hasn't done anything to you, so maybe just think about cleaning off your cans and go on with your day. Our next subject's a little bit more saucy. This next part is more of a historical piece of food fuckery. A1 sauce was created in 1831, Tabasco in 1868, Heinz ketchup in 1869, HP sauce in 1895, Marmite in 1902, and French's mustard in 1903. You may be thinking, okay, so? See, the mid to late 1800s saw an explosion in the creation of condiments in the West for a very specific reason. The reason is that in this time period, urbanization became much more prevalent in Western countries. And at the same time, their logistics had not upgraded to have, cars or refrigeration. This led to the sad reality that many people living in that time period in cities were eating rotten food. A lot of people living then turned to fish sauce and soy sauce that they got from Asian immigrants to cover the taste of their rotten food. Side note here, I do think that Asia probably was ahead of the game on condiments due to the fact that they had much more stable civilizations and probably encountered some of these issues earlier. In this time period, a lot of new sauces were being created. Jane Austen really liked walnut ketchup. There's also banana ketchup and mushroom ketchup, which are still somewhat common. When you really think about that time period and think about what the food conditions were probably like, it is pretty bleak, and you understand why it would be like this. If you wanted some meat for dinner that night, you went down to the dirt road that was full of horse crap, and you went to the little stall, and they had some meat that had been hanging there for a couple days. The flies had gotten to it, and it's just disgusting. It's been out in the heat in like Philadelphia in July. It would almost be as disgusting as Burger King's fries. It also makes sense why everyone was eating soup back then, because you could season it up and boil it, and then you wouldn't notice the bad taste or texture. So even though I've given you a whole bunch of reasons in this video why our food today is a little gross, at least be happy that you're eating better than Charles Dickens was. Today I'm going to tell you about some little America spores that have flung off from this country, gone into other ones, propagated, and flourished in surprising ways, just like the mold in the salsa container I found in my fridge earlier. In other words, I'm going to tell you about some American things that have a strangely strong following in other countries. We're going to skip over some of the more commonly known ones, like Kraft mac and cheese in Canada, Spam anywhere the American military has had a big presence, or Raytheon in Israel. Let's move on to our first topic, which is a little bit trashy. One night, I was sitting at home, I was watching an American and a Welshman harass a Japanese vending machine, and I saw something that caught my eye. See, they pulled out this little trinket that looked like a raccoon, and at the top it said rascal. When I saw that, I thought that is a very specific piece of English that they've used on this Japanese product. I wonder if this has anything to do with the book I was forced to read in 4th grade. It turns out that it has everything to do with that book. The book I am referencing is Rascal, A Memoir of a Better Era by Sterling North, which came out in 1963 originally. A quick synopsis of this book is it's about the author growing up in Wisconsin in the early 1900s, specifically during World War I, and at some point he finds a baby raccoon and tries to keep it as a pet, which doesn't go well. And you may be sitting there thinking, what does this have to do with Japan? Well, I'm getting to that, calm down. In 1977, this book was turned into an anime, and it did very well and turned Rascal into a beloved character there. It was a somewhat common thing in this time period for anime to be made out of Western books. Another Western book with a weird amount of popularity in Japan is Anne of Green Gables, which got an anime a few years after Rascal. We don't actually care about that today though, because Anne of Green Gables is Canadian, and they won't share their Timbits with me. There's a big downside to Rascal's popularity in Japan though. The issue is that people in Japan watch this story about how awful of an idea it is to have a pet raccoon, and then imported raccoons to be their pets. The inevitable then happened, which is the raccoons got out because they have hands. The raccoons then proceeded to damage the local environment, including the wildlife, including outcompeting the tanuki, also known as the raccoon dog, because it's like a raccoon with no hands. I also want you to take a moment to consider what it would be like for the first tanuki to see a raccoon. Imagine you're a tanuki walking around the Japanese woods, and you see another tanuki, but it's a little weird. And then it stands up and it's holding things in its hand. It kind of be like the first scene in Men in Black where the guy comes in out of the field but the alien's inside him and he starts like moving weird, but for a tanuki. Much to the relief of this panicked tanuki, the Japanese government is trying to exterminate the raccoons. The only issue is they're having about as much success as Australia's had with their wars with the emus, the rabbits, and the cane toads. Japanese enthusiasm for Rascal has been waning of late. It's largely just confined to like knickknacks and stickers and that kind of thing. So it's kind of like the Japanese version of Garfield at this point. The only real difference being it's a bit less problematic to have a fat orange cat in your house than to have a raccoon running around your countryside destroying it. Next up, we're going to talk about your grandma's car.
Would you really rather have a Buick?
Buick is a car brand that many people are surprised is still alive. It feels like Buick should have shuffled off its mortal coil back in the 2000s with Pontiac, Saturn, Oldsmobile, but it didn't, and let me tell you why. While Buick only sold about 103,000 cars in the US in 2022, it sold 677,000 cars in China. That same year, the entire Ford F-Series of pickups, ranging from the electric Ford Lightning all the way up to the big F-650, which is used for like box trucks and stuff, it only sold 653,000 units in the US. Not only is China buying up Buicks like hotcakes, they have models we don't get here in the US. See, Buick doesn't even make cars in the US anymore. They just have 3 slightly different crossovers, including one that I've never seen before called the Invista, which kind of looks like they're trying to make a knockoff of the Lamborghini Urus, kind of like Ford used to make the Fusion look like a knockoff of the Aston Martins from the time. But if we go ahead and hop on over to the Chinese site for Buick, we see that they still make sedans, like the LaCrosse and the Regal. They also make minivans, including this one that's just called the Century, which used to be kind of a shitty car. But over there, it's the swaggiest ass minivan I've ever seen. It has the Rolls-Royce roof with the stars in it. After hearing all this, you may be thinking, why? In China, Buick has this perception of being the car that you're in if you're important. And a big part of this is actually why they're your grandma's car in the US. A lot of Chinese government officials rode around in Buicks, and a big part of this is they're big comfy cars, but they're not as flashy as like a Mercedes or a Rolls or a Cadillac. However, the trend of Chinese officials riding around in Buicks is starting to wane. The quality of Chinese cars has improved drastically, which leads to Chinese officials wanting to ride in them because that looks good because they're supporting a local company, which is fair for them to do anyways. The politicians in major car producing countries are usually only seen in domestic cars. Having said that, I did get a really funny image in my head of Joe Biden driving up to the White House in an R34. Here's my artistic representation of it. With that said, let's move on to something with even crunchier skin than Joe Biden. You're probably sitting there thinking that I'm going to tell you about KFC in Japan and about how they buy it on Christmas and everything. But I'm not. I'm not going to talk about that for 2 reasons. First of all the Japan YouTubers have already beat that dead horse into Tesco lasagna. And 2, I don't want this to be too Japan heavy. Instead, what we're talking about is some KFC sales numbers that I found interesting. About 25% of KFC sales comes from China, which is not surprising to me. Fried chicken's also a thing in China. They're about 1/6 of the world's population, and I had previously heard that the Chinese KFC did a collab with Genshin Impact. They are also not our focus. After that, about 15% of their sales comes from the US, which is also not surprising, it's from here. No, the thing I have an issue with is the next 2 countries on the list. What on earth is wrong with you, United Kingdom and Australia? How are you each responsible for 7% of their sales? Australia, you have a smaller population than Texas, and somehow you are eating almost half as much chicken as the entire United States? And UK people, how can you be out here talking up your Nando's, your fish and chips, your wonderful Indian food, and then you're gobbling the Colonel's meat with this veracity? You two need to get it together. Work on yourselves. Next topic. Specifically, one kind of Disney product. Since the year 1941, 210 million Captain America comics have been sold. In the year 2005, Disney sold 114 million Disney comics. The European viewers watching this are thinking, wow, that's slightly surprising. The American viewers are thinking, what the fuck is a Disney comic? You see, although they are basically non-existent in the United States, comic books starring Disney characters like Donald and Mickey are extremely popular in Europe. This started out because in the 50s, Disney sold off the rights to a lot of their characters to be used in comics in Europe because they didn't really care about the market and it was an easy way to make more money. Donald Duck is very popular in the strange grouping of all the Nordic countries plus Italy. Mickey Mouse comics are very popular in Germany, confirming my suspicion that Mickey Mouse is in fact the David Hasselhoff of rodents. The German Mickey Mouse comic book has sold over 1 billion copies since 1951. A few years ago, IDW tried publishing some of these European-made comic books in the US with English translations, and they stopped shortly after because no one bought them. This one kind of stands out from the others in this video. The others, it's kind of like, why is this so popular somewhere else that's not America? This one, it's, why is this not popular in America? After all, America is the home of Disney, there's tons of Disney adults, it's permeated our culture to the point that it almost got away with putting a theme park next to one of the major Civil War battlegrounds, and yet they cannot sell a single comic book here. Next up is probably the most unexpected entry on this list. I told you it's unexpected. You see, there are communities made up of the descendants of Confederate sympathizers in Brazil. During the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, there were a lot of disgruntled Southerners, and a lot of those disgruntled Southerners knew how to run cash crop plantations. Emperor Pedro II of Brazil saw this as an opportunity and said, "Come to Brazil, I'll give you some cheap land to farm on." It also helped that Brazil still had legal slavery. About 20,000 Southerners immigrated, and most of them settled in the state of Sao Paulo. A lot of them focused around the modern-day cities of Santa Barbara de Oeste and Americana. Santa Barbara de Oeste is actually believed to have the first Protestant cemetery and church built in Brazil because of these immigrants. In 1972, the governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, and his wife Rosalind Carter visited Santa Barbara de Oeste. They visited the cemetery on this trip because Rosalind Carter went and laid flowers at her great-uncle's grave, who was one of the original Confederados. I want to be clear here, It's not like if you go to the state of Sao Paulo and take a wrong turn, you end up in the Candyland plantation from Django Unchained. The descendants of the Confederados have largely assimilated into Brazilian culture, they just have some of the traditions that they've kept alive. For instance, some southern crops are grown in the area, like pecans and watermelons. Some people make southern food down there, like southern style fried chicken, or even chess pie. For those of you who do not know what chess pie is, it is pecan pie, hold the pecans. I would argue that chess pie is a low tier pie below even just chocolate pudding pie, and nowhere near higher tier pies like pumpkin, pecan fudge, key lime, or cheesecake, which is a pie because it is filling in a crust and not a glutinous structure. Also, every year they hold an event called Festa Confederada. This is like a little festival where some of the men will dress up like Civil War soldiers, some of the women will dress up like Scarlett O'Hara, and they eat American food, and all the proceeds go to preserving the historic buildings. The Confederado descendants have even helped raise money to build a museum of immigration in Santa Barbara do Oeste, which is all about how great immigration has been for Brazil. Today we are going to talk about the 8 species of bears that are currently alive. To do some housekeeping at the start, we won't be talking about the red panda because DNA testing has shown that it is not closely related to the giant panda or other bears. It is actually in the clade Mustaloideae, which means that it is more related to badgers and raccoons. The red panda is to the raccoon what the Dale Earnhardt Jr. edition is to the 2004 Monte Carlo. We also won't be talking about the koala because it is also not a bear. It is a marsupial and it has a pouch where it raises its young. Koala also has a brain smoother than a Brazilian booty and is thought to be the dumbest mammal pound for pound. We also won't be talking about West Hollywood bears because they're just big boys that want love. We're about to get started, but before I do, I'm going to do the YouTuber thing and tell you to stay tuned in the video because later on I'm going to tell you which bears have the largest and smallest gentle bear sausages.
Oh, my fellow Americans!
We are going to start off with the American black bear. They live in Canada, Mexico, and America, hence the name. They are the bear with the largest population. It is believed that there are over 500,000 of them. They are actually a little on the large side for a bear, although small compared to the other North American bears. Usually they top out around 550 pounds, but somewhere in the 200s is more common. There are several subspecies of these bears. It's mostly just little differences in colors and size. The size differences are possibly due to an interesting little rule in biology called Bergmann's rule. This rule basically states that when animals have a large range in which they live, the populations in colder climates tend to have larger individuals than the populations in warmer climates. There are exceptions to this rule, but it does work for our friend the American black bear. One of the more interesting things about these bears is that despite being called black bears, they come in a wide range of colors. The ones on the East Coast are almost always black, but as you go west, there's more and more variety in the colors to the point that at Yosemite Park, only about 9% of the bears are black. They can be white either from being albino or just having white fur while still retaining the pigment in their eyes and skin, the second of which is most common in British Columbia, where they are sometimes called Kermode bears or spirit bears. In British Columbia, the percentage of the black bear population that is white is believed to be about 10%. In Alaska and northern British Columbia, they also have what are called glacier bears, that they are these really pretty grayish blue bears. Their colors also range from the familiar jet black, to a blonde color, to a cinnamon color, to a light brown, and all the way to a dark chocolatey brown, like this little shit who's gonna get his ass beat if he keeps taking the trash out of the dumpster and putting it in my yard. The American black bear mostly eats plants, bugs, carrion, and trash. Their love of trash and dead stuff is why the play dead when you see a bear thing is not taught in places that only have black bears. With black bears, if you see one, you're supposed to yell at it and look big and try and look scary, or if you're currently being attacked by one while watching this video, try to fight it. The goal is to make it seem like you are too much trouble to eat. Most black bear attacks in North America are bears that have something wrong with them, or are too familiar with humans because they're being fed by dumbasses. Most of the attacks do not end up in death, though. The American black bear is listed as least concern for conservation, aside from the glacier bear subspecies, which is threatened, as is the bear in my yard, who has been threatened by me several times. Next up, we got the Asian black bear. These bears have a range from Iran to Southeast Asia to the east coast of Russia and over the sea to Japan and Taiwan. The easiest way to tell an Asian black bear from an American black bear is that the Asian black bear has long ruff on the side of its face that kind of makes it look like Otto Man from The Simpsons. Asian black bears usually top out around 310 pounds, and they also mostly eat plants, garbage, and bugs. There are 7 subspecies of these guys, with mostly just size and fur thickness differences depending on their environment. There's the Baluchistan bear, which today you get to find out that Baluchistan is the area where Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan meet. There's the Formosan black bear in Taiwan. There's the Japanese black bear. There's the Himalayan black bear. There's the Indochina black bear. There's the Tibetan black bear, and there's the Ussuri black bear, which lives up in Korea and eastern Russia. By the way, if you ever look up the Siberian Federal District on a map, it looks very excited. These bears are one of the species that has the most run-ins with humans, and they're also known to be good climbers and spend up to half of their time in trees. These bears are mostly listed as vulnerable, except for the Baluchistan bear, which is listed as critically endangered. These bears are losing numbers because of a few reasons. One being that they are losing their habitat, and secondly because the bears are often captured in the wild and then kept in tiny cages to keep them from moving while they have a tube implanted in their gallbladder to siphon out the bile they produce so it can be used in traditional medicine. Despite the internet rumors, the sun bear is in fact a bear and not a man in a suit. If you want to hear a better theory about people and animal suits, check out my cryptid video. The sun bear is the smallest bear species, topping out at around 145 pounds, or about the same size as Floyd Mayweather, who also shares a reading comprehension level with it. Sun bears live in Southeast Asia, which leads to a couple interesting differences from their relatives. Because the areas where they live are always warm, sun bears do not hibernate and they breed throughout the year instead of having a set season. They mostly eat plants and bugs, and occasionally they might get a lizard. Their bug eating is one of the main reasons for one of their most famous attributes, their tongue, which can reach 10 inches long. They also have very girthy canines that help them peel the bark off of trees to find bugs. These bears are sometimes eaten by tigers, leopards, and a very fun animal I just learned about called the dhole, which hunts in packs and kind of looks like a cross between a fox and a wolf. These bears like to be in trees more than any other bear. They climb up there to find food and to sunbathe. They are a little odd in some other ways. For one, they are possibly the smartest bear. They have solved puzzles in zoos to get food, and they are very good at mimicking facial expressions. They often stand on their hind legs to get a good look at things, partially due to how dense the vegetation is in their habitat. Also, they are small, so it's easier for them to support themselves than some other bears. Sun bears are considered vulnerable. There may be fewer than 1,000 left in the wild due to habitat loss and their use in traditional medicine. The sloth bear is native to Sri Lanka and India, and sometimes India's neighbors like Nepal, because bears do not care about geopolitical borders. Their size usually tops out around 320 pounds. This bear is also called the labiated bear because it has a bit of an underbite which helps it slurp up bugs. Bit of a Yale man, you might say. They mostly eat bugs, fruit, and carrion. This is the bear that commits the most attacks on humans, partially because they live in such a populated place. Apparently these bears also have a tendency to not really kill their victim, but instead to suck and gnaw on people's limbs till they look like the stuff they make chicken nuggets out of. A lot of the attacks are thought to be out of fear or surprise. Ironically, sloth bears aren't great climbers, so they are more stand and fight than a lot of other bears. In the past, sloth bears were often kept as pets and trained as dancing bears to do street performances. The street bears were often treated poorly, having had teeth removed and fitted with a nose ring that was used to leash them. This was banned in 1972, and supposedly there are no more dancing bears in India today. They are considered a vulnerable species today, with somewhere around 20,000 left in the wild. They face habitat loss, being killed by farmers, and being used in traditional medicine. The spectacled bear lives in the northwest part of South America, mostly in the Andes in what are called cloud forests, which are wet forests up in the mountains. They are also sometimes seen in the lower, dry lowlands. They are the only bear native to South America, and they top out around 440 pounds. This actually makes it the largest native land animal in South America that is not a tapir. And if you're sitting there thinking, oh, well, Pablo Escobar's hippos are bigger, well, those aren't native animals, so be quiet. Spectacled bear is also believed to be the closest living relative to the short-faced bears, which were the largest bears to ever live. Based on the fossils of them, we think they probably got over 4,000 pounds. These short-faced bears are believed to have gone extinct when the other megafauna died out, which made it harder for them to get enough food. If you are unfamiliar with megafauna, the Americas had some insane wildlife thousands of years ago that died out due to weather changes and humans coming over the land bridge. The megafauna included things that you've definitely heard of, like mammoths or the spilodon, which was the saber-toothed tiger, and some things you might not have heard of, like the giant armadillo called the Glyptotherium. There were also beavers that were over 6 feet long, and there was the giant sloths, which were so big that they would take avocados off the tree while they're standing on the ground. Little bonus fact, the seeds and fruit are made to be pooped out whole by the animal that eats them. Giant sloths ate avocados. The spectacled bear is called that because of the markings on its face. The markings also kind of remind me of hentai kamen. These bears tend to be very shy. They usually climb up trees as soon as they see a human. They eat mostly plants, possibly more than 90% of their diet is plant-based. Everything from fruits and palms in the cloud forest to cactus in the scrublands. They do sometimes prey on cattle and crops, which leads to their human issues. They are considered a vulnerable species. There's probably about 6,000 to 10,000 of them left in the wild, and their main issue is habitat loss and run-ins with people. The brown bear is kind of a mess to talk about. Apparently there's no real consensus on how many subspecies of brown bear there are, partially due to it having a huge range that takes up a significant percentage of the northern hemisphere. This means that you have to get people from a lot of different countries to agree on something. The amount of subspecies is definitely in the double digits though. Brown bears are omnivorous and will eat pretty much anything they can get their big old brown paws on. As you know if you've ever watched a nature documentary, they like to eat fish. They're also down for plants, bugs, rodents, and larger animals that have something wrong with them that makes them easier to catch. Here in North America, it is most widely believed that we have 2 subspecies that are still alive. Those 2 subspecies are the North American brown bear, aka the grizzly, and the Kodiak. The biggest difference between these 2 bears is their bigness. Generally, mainland grizzly bears top out at around 800 pounds, while the bears that live on Kodiak Island will often grow to over 1,000 pounds. One particular Kodiak named Clyde that lived in the zoo in Bismarck, North Dakota is believed to have at one point been 2,400 pounds and had a 9-inch fat layer at the time of his death. He was a true American hero. The other big difference between the 2 is that Kodiaks love pit bull. North America also used to have the Mexican grizzly bear and the California grizzly bear, which the California grizzly bear is on the state flag of California. The Mexican grizzly is believed to have died out in the 60s, and the California is believed to have died out in the 20s. The various brown bear subspecies differ mostly in color, size, and various behavior changes due to environment. The colors on the different brown bear subspecies range from the Tibetan blue bear, who's almost like a gunmetal blue, to the beautiful Syrian brown bear, which looks like Guy Fieri's tips. Speaking of tips, the Syrian bear is also the only bear with white claws. In another deserty location, we have the gobi bear, which is the smallest brown bear subspecies. It tops out at around 300 pounds. Because of their size and where they live, they are another low-protein bear, with animals making up less than 10% of their diet. In addition to being soy boys, the gobi bear is also inbred to the point where their DNA has a low number of alleles causing reproductive issues. The most common brown bear subspecies is the Eurasian brown bear. It is believed that there are more than 200,000 of them in the wild. They are kind of in the middle on size, they're kind of a normal brown color, and they attack very few people. They in fact may be the average bear. Any older European fairy tale or story that mentions a bear is most likely talking about one of these. They were at one time even more widespread, but have seen population declines, including being wiped out in places like England, where they were all stabbed to death 1500 to 3000 years ago. An amazing fact I found is that in the last 100 years, there have only been 2 bear attack deaths in Scandinavia, which is as much as the US has in 1 year. On the other hand, the Ussuri brown bear loves throwing paws with humans. These bears live in Japan, Korea, Eastern Russia, and Manchuria. In Hokkaido, which is about the size of Maine, there have been over 150 Ussuri brown bear attacks since the 60s. The attack rate is actually believed to be increasing because their numbers are rebounding while the human population in the area is decreasing, causing them to feel more comfortable being near settlements. These guys are also one of the darkest brown bears and are quite large. They are believed to be the ancestor of America's grizzlies. Brown bears as a whole are labeled as least concern for conservation since there are believed to be over 200,000 of them in the wild, although some subspecies are considered threatened and are protected, such as the gobi bear. That's right, it's time for the Oreo of bears, the giant panda. Pandas top out at about 350 pounds. They do have some major differences from other bears. Firstly, their diet is almost entirely plant-based. As much as 90% of their diet is bamboo, although they do sometimes eat other grasses and shoots and occasionally bugs or other small animals if they find a dead one. Fun fact, as people have spent more time studying the diets of animals, it seems like there might not be any true obligate herbivores. Grazing animals are often seen eating a bug or a dead mouse or something like that if they find it, and big ocean filter feeders have been seen to grab small fish or krill. Because of their diet, pandas have 2 unique adaptations to help with the bamboo. One is they have bigger molars and a stronger jaw than other bears to help crunch the bamboo, and the other is that they have thumbs. Another interesting adaptation is that they have the smallest bear penises. You thought I forgot about it, didn't you? This sounds like a messed up joke, but it's actually the truth. I can actually give you a visual depiction of this without getting too weird thanks to the wonder that is the baculum. You may be wondering, what is a baculum? Well, many mammals actually have a bone in their penis and it is called the baculum. Here's a chart showing the different baculums of bears. The little thing in the top right that looks like a seashell is actually the panda baculum. The big one at the bottom belongs to extinct species, and the next 2 biggest are polar and brown. There are actually 2 subspecies of giant panda. One is the normal one that you think of. It mostly lives in Sichuan. Then there's the kinling panda, which has the same pattern as the normal panda, but it is brown where the other panda has black. The panda is a conservation success story. Recently it was upgraded to threatened from endangered. There may have been less than 1,000 wild pandas at one point, largely due to habitat loss and poaching, and now it might have as high as 3,000 in the wild, as well as a few hundred in captivity.
This is the Polar Express!
The polar bear is the largest living bear, as well as the largest living carnivore in the world. These frozen fellows top out at about 1,700 pounds. A little fun characteristic of them is that they have black skin under their fur, and their outer fur is built in such a way that it scatters light down under the underfur and onto the black skin to help keep them warm. Polar bears are also dichromatic, which means that they only have 2 kinds of cone cells in their eyes as opposed to the 3 kinds we have. That means that they cannot see the color red, which also means that the Coca-Cola advertising team engaged in buffoonery when they chose it as a mascot. The polar bear lives in much of the Arctic Circle, although not in Scandinavia because lutefisk freaks them out. Surprisingly, concerning their environment, polar bears only hibernate when they're pregnant. Another interesting fact about them, though, is that polar bears usually have enough fat on them to go a few months without eating. Out of all the bears, they have by far the most meat-heavy diet. If they find some seaweed or something, they might try it out, but otherwise they just go with meat. Seals are their most common prey. They usually try to catch them when they're on the ice, but sometimes they do try to catch them in the water. Another food source for them is that after walruses follow the teaches of peaches and have sex on the beaches, the polar bears will run up on the walruses and get them to stampede so that they crush their children in their panic, giving the bear a wonderful snack. They are also known to hunt land animals like caribou, and occasionally they'll try to get small whales like beluga and narwhal when they get stuck in the shallows. Some polar bears have also started eating more trash because they're stuck on the land more often with the ice melting. Polar bears are considered to be a vulnerable species. There's probably about 30,000 of them left in the wild, and their main threat is that the ice they prefer to hunt from is melting. Besides hunting difficulties, this is adding an extra layer to them, which is they're encountering humans more, and if they're going towns a lot, they might be killed as a nuisance bear. Well, that's all I have for you. Have a good day and eat something good. This may surprise many Europeans clicking on this, but the best-selling French car brand in the US for the last 30 years has been Bugatti. This is despite the fact that Bugatti usually makes them around 100 cars a year. The big three of France, Citroën, Peugeot, Renault, all pulled out of the US by the early 90s. Today I'm going to tell you some of the reasons why this happened. First off, don't come in here with something like, well, actually, my uncle has a Renault Dauphine. Because tell me, how many times have you seen a French car just driving around out here? How many times have you seen one in the Walmart parking lot when you go to buy milk in the US? Seeing a French car over here is about as common as it is to see a North American esports team win a major tournament. Secondly, there's going to be some people come in here and try to argue that the reason these companies struggled in America is because the Americans are racist towards the French. If that little thought is wiggling through your brain wrinkles, you got to be on those Enid, Oklahoma mind blowers. Do you really think that Americans in the mid-20th century had more animosity towards the French than they did towards the Germans and the Japanese whose cars have sold great here? Read a book. Also, people often bring up unreliability as a reason they failed, and I think this is a cop-out answer for one simple reason. The British were able to sell cars here. They sold hundreds of thousands of MGBs in the US, and they didn't even come with a radiator large enough to keep them cool in most of the US. There are even now companies in the US that make parts for MGBs to make them actually work. On top of that, Land Rovers and Jaguars are both very common in the US, despite the fact that historically, their mechanics are about as sorted out as Boris Johnson's hair. If you ever want an interesting look into human psychology, go to a Land Rover owner's forum. They sound like they're in an abusive relationship and trying to defend it. No, I promise it's completely normal to put a new water pump in a car every 3 years. Anyone who says otherwise is lying. The unreliability definitely didn't help the French, but I don't think it was the end-all, be-all of their issues here. Now let's get right to how the French fumbled the US car market like they fumbled the Battle of Agincourt. One of the biggest issues in selling cars in more than one place is that you have to accommodate more than one set of rules. This is a big part of why, if you ever watched Top Gear back in the day, you would see cars that aren't sold here, even though the company operates here. There are a ton of differences between the EU and US regulations. Some things are more strict in the US, some things are more strict in the EU. For instance, the EU requirements require better headlights, but the US has better rollover standards because Ford and Firestone tried to kill everyone with Explorers in the 90s. Also, as you can see in this very helpful study I found, modern emissions regulations vary greatly between the two areas. The US is more strict on nitrogen oxides and non-methane organic gases, while the EU is tougher on carbon. Also, the EU makes its rules easier for diesel cars where the US does not. That's why diesel passenger cars have been pretty rare in the US for the past few decades, while they make up to 13% of cars sold in Europe each year. I bring this up because regulations killed Citroën in the US. See, in the 70s, Citroën made a name for themselves with their hydro-pneumatic suspension. This was a system that used mineral oil reservoirs that are pressurized with nitrogen to perform actions such as leveling the car. What the US regulators took issue with is at the time, there were rules about how high off the ground your bumper had to be. This was an issue for the Citroën DS because it had adjustable ride height due to its mineral oil shenanigans. This, in conjunction with overall poor sales, caused Citroën to pull out of the US in 1974. The messed up part of this is the US changed the rule in 1981, which would have allowed this car. Citroën was also having a lot of financial issues in general at this time. In 1936, Citroën was bought by Michelin because they were going broke. Then in 1968, Michelin was starting to get tired of owning Citroën and sold 49% of it to Fiat. Weirdly, at the same time they did this, they also bought Maserati. Then in 1974, the same year they left America, the French government had Michelin give up Citroën so they could merge with Peugeot and try to keep them from tanking the French economy. They also sold off Maserati to De Tomaso, who somehow had money at that moment. And now, 2 years ago, Peugeot Citroën merged with Fiat Chrysler, which means that like those stories about lost pets that find their way home, Maserati has found their way home to the French. Also, side note, when the companies merged, Ferrari somehow ran away and became its own company again. The more you know. One of the big challenges in doing just about anything in America is how spread out we are. This map is from 2010, but it's good enough for the point I'm trying to make. The purple represents metropolitan areas, which is what the Census Bureau calls places with more than 50,000 people living in them. There are 381 of these in the US. On top of that, there are the green dots, which are micropolitan areas, which have 10 to 50k people in them. There are 536 of them. Add to that the white areas, which are non-metro areas where 6% of the population lives. 6% of the population of the US is pretty close to the current population of Romania. In order to cover this spread out populace, Peugeot had a grand total of 151 dealerships in 1991 when they pulled out of the market. They didn't even have half the metro areas in the US covered. Earlier in the 20th century, Americans were even more spread out, with 50% of them living in rural areas, which meant that having a small number of dealerships was an even bigger issue. Because remember, a dealership is not just a car store. It's also where you're supposed to go if something is wrong with your car. One of the main jobs of a car, especially in the era when French cars were still being sold here, was to take the family on a vacation. If you don't have any dealerships, people are not going to feel comfy driving across the country in your car. Citroën also peaked at about 170 dealerships, and you don't want to be lost in the middle of the woods in Idaho trying to figure out how to get new mineral oil testicles for your DS. If you want some perspective on just how minuscule 151 dealerships was in the scheme of things in 1991, there were 3,000 Chevrolet dealerships in the US. Or even crazier, there were 200 Lexus dealerships by then, despite the fact that they only started selling Lexuses in the US in 1989. To Renault's credit, they actually saw that this is an issue, but they tried to fix it in the weirdest way possible. Renault bought into AMC in order to use their dealership network. Not a terrible idea on paper. In 1980, AMC had about 1,500 dealerships. Great. The issue is, by the 80s, the only reason you went to an AMC dealership was to buy an off-road vehicle. Gone was AMC's glory days of building cars like the Javelin, the Matador, and one of the coolest cars ever made, the Gremlin. In the 80s, the only reason you went to an AMC dealership was to buy a Wrangler, a Cherokee, a Wagoneer, or an Eagle, which was like a four-wheel drive station wagon, kind of like the Outback is today. So the sales strategy of somehow convincing people that came in for something that they could drive on a hunting trip, that what they actually wanted was a slow economy car, had some flaws. Another potential flaw with this plan that I saw referenced online is that I saw a couple people saying that at these AMC Renault dealerships, AMC paid better commission. I don't have hard proof on that last part though, so take it with a grain of salt. One of the main selling points of the major French car brands in Europe is their affordability. Today, here in the US, there are only 3 new cars you can buy for under $20,000. The Mitsubishi Mirage, the Kia Rio, and the Nissan Versa, all of which start around $18,000. Meanwhile, right now in France, there are cars like the Citroen C1 that starts at just 12,350 euros, which is about $13,400. When the French were still selling cars in the US though, they did not have this advantage. The Citroen 2CV was $1,195 when it came out in the US in 1955. This did make it one of the cheapest new cars in the US at the time, but it wasn't really a good value. There were several other car models like the Ford Custom that were only a few $100s more, which adjusted for inflation would only be about $3,000 more. The issue with this is that the 2CV came with a 425cc engine that only made about 12 horsepower. On a good day, that could get you up to about 50 miles an hour. The Ford Custom, on the other hand, had a 4.8-liter V8 that made around 200 horsepower. With the distances Americans have to travel on a regular basis, the 2CV was not really practical. These other cars were able to maintain the common 65-mile-an-hour speed limit easily, where I'm sure the 2CV would sound like it was going to explode at that 50-mile-an-hour top speed. For our EU friends that don't know what I mean, let me give you an example. If I have to go see a specialist doctor, it's about 160 kilometers or 100 miles each way because of our busted-ass infrastructure. The other issue was that for a little bit more money on those American cars, you could get air conditioning, which the French still are not really big on. By 1960, 20% of new cars in the US were bought with air conditioning, and that was closer to 80% in the southern half of the country. Again, for any EU friends watching that don't understand why, you can find a near endless supply of videos where local news channels bake cookies on the dash of a car whenever they need to fill time. These air conditioners at the time were even pretty good. The compressors in GM vehicles from this time period were made by Frigid Air, the fridge company who GM owned. The last major issue for the 2CV in the 50s was the fact that thousands of World War II surplus Jeeps were being sold by the government for as little as a few $100s. Many Americans would be familiar with driving these Jeeps, and they would become popular in farms and in the country, which was the main market for the 2CV. Renault, on the other hand, actually bothered to make a factory in the US, but they didn't do that till 1982 when they were making the alliance with AMC. This let them sell it for about $5,500, which was pretty comparable to the Civic and the Corolla. Motor Trend also got 37 miles per gallon in their 83 alliance, which was pretty good for the time, and a big deal because gas prices were high in the early 80s. It actually did pretty well at first, selling about 142K in 83 and 208K in 84. But as the 80s continued and gas prices fell, so did Alliance sales. The 86 and 87 model years sold a combined 100K units in the US. Interestingly, in Europe, the Alliance was called a Renault 9 if it was a sedan, or a Renault 11 if it was a hatchback. This is ironic because it was like 911 for Renault's chances in America. It was the last car they sold in the US with a Renault badge on it. In case you were wondering, when Renault pulled out of AMC and America in 1987, Chrysler bought out AMC and got the Jeep brand in it. They also sold a few rebadged Renaults till they decided it wasn't worth it. Part of the reason Renault gave up on America at that specific time was because their CEO was assassinated. This was possibly due to some unpopular moves he made to make Renault profitable, including closing plants and investing more in the American side. The murders were blamed on a group called Action Directe, who were libertarian communists. I'm gonna be honest with you, till I wrote this script, I did not know those were terms that could go together. It's almost like being a ladies' man shonen protagonist. His successors were not as interested in trying to grow their market in the US. The more luxury-oriented models also had a very hard time competing with Lincoln and Cadillac here in the US.
Also, looking through old car reviews of things like the Peugeot 604, I saw it mostly compared to the Mercedes 300D, complaining that the Peugeot had worse gas mileage. The lack of brand recognition in the US and the French being known for affordable cars meant that it did not have the prestige of the Germans or Jaguar for what people wanted in a foreign-made luxury car. We could do more examples, but that would bog down the video. Overall, the French tended to have a hard time competing on price and features, with their most successful cars being things like the Renault Dauphine and the Citroën DS. These mostly won over people with their styling. The more basic-looking cars just didn't have a chance to stand out. Also, in general, very budget-oriented cars tend to struggle in the US due to a robust used car market. A lot of people in the older generation in the US would buy a beater for a few $100s and run it till it needed to repair that cost too much, then sell it for scrap and buy another junker. Peugeot ended up pulling out of the US in 1991 due to these pricing issues. They even tried a plan where they sold Peugeot 505s with a sweetheart deal to New York taxi drivers. It's kind of an advertising scheme. The issue was that the New York cabbies were slow to pick them up because they were still about $5,000 more than a Chevy Caprice or a Ford Crown Victoria. On top of that, the suspension had issues with New York roads and the parts had to be shipped from France, creating a wait time. So it may have been one of the worst PR stunts in automotive history. If you are in America and desperately want your commute to feel like you are inside Gerard Depardieu, I do have good news. Renault is supposedly planning a comeback to the US as early as 2027. This time they may be selling out of Nissan dealerships due to them being part of the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi Alliance. This makes it so that the three companies have shared technology and resources and possibly dealerships in the future. The Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi Alliance also makes it annoying to look up info of the car known as the Renault Alliance. Although there have been rumors that Peugeot and Citroën might come back to the US due to the Stellantis merger, they have been adamant in denying it recently. I do have a theory that we will be getting some of their cars as Chryslers though. The Chrysler 300 is in process of ending production, meaning that soon the only vehicle they will be selling will be the Pacifica. I feel like there's a good chance that they will fill out their lineup with some Citroëns and Peugeots. It could just be a new badge or maybe a Dodge engine that helps parts availability, but it seems silly to keep a whole brand alive to sell one minivan and its hybrid version. That's all I got for you. Have a good day and eat something good. What's up, you guys? I'm glad that YouTube has led you to my lead talk. Today, I'm going to tell you what lead is, why it is toxic, and its uses throughout history. Let's get started. It's a metal. But let's go a bit deeper than that. Lead is number 82 on the periodic table, which in case you didn't pay attention in chemistry class, that means it has 82 protons. This makes it denser than a lot of the normal metals you run into on a daily basis. It is almost 5 times more dense than aluminum, and is more dense than iron, copper, zinc, and silver. It is, however, less dense than gold and tungsten, but those two are expensive, which is why they are less common as fishing weights. The 4 isotopes of lead that are found in nature are 204, 206, 207, and 208. Those are their mass numbers, which come from adding up the number of protons and the number of neutrons in the nucleus of the atom. Lead 208 is actually believed to be the heaviest completely stable nucleus. It used to be believed that bismuth 209 was the heaviest stable nucleus, till it was discovered to decay in 2003. I have no proof of this, but I think it is possible that it did not decay prior to the year 2003. I think it's possible that the structure of the universe was damaged that year when 3 of the worst movies ever made were released in that one year. The movies in question being Geely, from Justin and Kelly, and the movie Quigley, where Gary Busey plays a Pomeranian. Lead is a comparatively weak metal. It scores a 1.5 on the Mohs scale, which measures how hard it is to scratch a material. This means that you can scratch it with things like your fingernail, dry ice, or many kinds of wood. Lead also has a pretty low melting point at just 327.5 Celsius or 621.5 Fahrenheit, which played a role in it being one of the first metals used by humanity. It was easy to smelt and cast with just a wood fire, which burns at around 900 Fahrenheit or 482 Celsius. It is also a very corrosion-resistant material, which made it very popular for things like roofing. Lead also does not have a natural resonance frequency, which makes it a popular material for the pipes on pipe organs. Lead poisoning can affect your body in a number of ways, but they're all tied to one simple fact. Lead has a +2 charge. Again, a little chemistry refresher. Atoms all have electrons surrounding them. Some atoms would like more electrons, and some atoms would like less. So lead has 2 more electrons than it wants, so it is looking for someone that is short 2 electrons. When lead does find someone that is short 2 electrons, they link together and formed a bond. This is important because there are some other elements that also have a +2 charge as well as a similar orbit distance for their electrons. These are calcium and zinc. Even if you do not know a lot about nutrition, you can probably guess that calcium and zinc are important for your body if you've ever walked down the vitamin aisle. Both are used in the building of a lot of different proteins in your body. Lead can get in the way when building the proteins and change how the protein functions. Although lead is close enough to zinc and calcium to replace them physically, it does not react the same way. For instance, when calcium gets cupped by lead in the production of synaptotagmin 1, a protein that operates in your brain, the lead takes less energy to release from the protein than the calcium, causing the protein to do its job randomly instead of a steady pace that calcium releases it in. Lead poisoning can easily become a long-term issue due to its ability to stay in a person's fat and bones. An interesting physical sign that some people have with lead poisoning is called Burton's line. The bacteria that live in your mouth can create sulfur, and that sulfur can react with the lead in someone's system to create a thin line of lead sulfide lining the area where the gums meet the teeth. Lead poisoning can affect most parts of your body. It has been found to be a risk factor in hearing loss, blindness, diabetes, high blood pressure, learning disabilities, low sperm count, and much, much more. One of the more studied aspects of lead poisoning has been its neurological effects. Numerous theories have been put forward about the effects of lead on crime. In the US, crime rates rose almost continuously till it peaked in the 80s. Lead has its worst effects when children are exposed to it, when it can greatly change the formation of their brain. These changes can affect a person for life, and often leads to things like increased aggression, anxiety, mood swings, depression, and even schizophrenia. Lead paint was banned in the US for use in homes in 1978, and the phase-out of leaded gas in cars was also started in the late 70s. Here's a lovely chart that shows what percentage of deaths were homicides by year. In the 1950s, this number was usually around 0.5%, and in the 21st century, it's been bouncing around between 0.6% and 0.8%. But from 1973 to 1995, it was over 1% for all but a couple of years. Those couple of years were just under 1%, and it peaked in 1991 at 1.21%. I use the US for this example, but many countries have similar graphs, maybe with some different windows due to when their laws were enacted. There are some other factors that may have played into this, but lead was more than likely a large part of it. An added layer to this is that in many places the poorer side of town is correlated to the prevailing wind direction. Here are three maps. The orange and red one shows manufacturing job density in London, with the dark red being the densest. The grayscale maps shows lead concentrations in the soil in London, with the darker areas having more lead. And the blue and purple one shows how well students in different parts of London did on tests, with dark purple being the lowest scoring. The prevailing wind in London comes from the southwest and goes to the northeast. As you can see, many of the worst performing schools are on the northeast of the manufacturing areas. The few purple outliers would have been northeast of two major lead emitters just a few decades ago. The Tandem Works in Merton, that made lead products such as solder, and a bit more east and northeast was the Battersea Power Station. Battersea was an enormous coal power plant, and coal ash is a major source of lead. Similar comparisons can be made in other places, especially if you add in historical manufacturing, as many of the dirtier kinds of manufacturing have been moved out of cities due to regulations starting in the latter 20th century. In many places, including London, war may have also added to the amount of heavy metals in the soil near industrial areas. Industrial areas are often among the first places in a city to be bombed or shelled in a war. It has been found that many inner city areas have unsafe levels of lead in the ground. These parts of town are often where the most violent crime happens and have the lowest test scores. Oftentimes, leaders try to blame things like this on any number of things, including the color of resident skin or heritage, even if they do so with some replacement words. The actual issue is the poor material conditions and quite possibly the fact that the ground they walk on is trying to kill them. In the description below, I have linked a site that lets you look at the Superfund sites near you if you are in the US. These are places that the EPA considers contaminated and are trying to clean up or at least keep people away from. Not all of them are due to lead, but a lot of them are. You can use it to see if there is any major contamination areas near you. I could not find a site for other countries that works the same way, but I have included an agricultural study of heavy metals in European soil that has a good map of the most affected provinces across Europe. Going forward, I'm going to start having an additional reading section in the description for anything I find during research that I think you guys might find interesting. As I mentioned before, lead was one of the first metals to be used by humans. This is one of the oldest known lead objects made by humans. It was found in a cave in Israel, and according to radiocarbon dating on the wooden handle, it was made in around 5000 BC. We're not sure what it is though. The paper I read proposed that it could have been a ceremonial mace or a spindle. It also kind of looks like an early prototype of the PlayStation Move. There are some even earlier man-made items that used lead as pigment, including some cave paintings and a statue in Turkey. Paints and glazes have been one of the main uses for lead from the dawn of civilization till today. The terracotta army in China that you've probably seen before has lead residue from the paint that was used on the soldiers. Many of the classic white Greek statues that you know would have also been painted with lead. But it fell off. Lead actually has the ability to make paint more durable and dry faster, and depending on what it is bonded with, it can make yellow, red, or white pigment. To this day, there are still oil painters that swear by lead white due to it being a bit warmer of a color than the titanium white that is more common in most paints. Much of the lead production in early antiquity was actually kind of incidental. One of the main ores for lead is called galena, and it also contains silver. People tend to prefer silver to lead because it is not ugly, weak, and toxic. Shocking, I know. The Egyptians and Greeks had a few uses for it, including weights for fish nets, coins, and makeup. Fishing weights are obviously one of the uses that has continued into modern day. In recent years, many places have either banned lead fishing weights, also known as sinkers, or are in the process of banning it. You might think that the concern would be having lead leach into the water, especially in places where the fishing spot is also a water source for people. But from what I have seen, most of the bills to ban lead sinkers don't seem to focus on that. The main issue seems to be birds. Birds, including waterfowl, look for small stones known as grit to keep in their gizzard. The gizzard is part of their digestive system, and its job is to use the grit they swallow to grind their food so it digests better. Apparently, it is not uncommon for waterfowl, like ducks and geese, to find sinkers that have fallen off people's lines and swallow it to be grit. The sinker then leaches lead into the bird and can kill it. It was also used for a variety of traditional medicines in China, including as a contraceptive, which would technically work, I guess, but the side effect warning would look like the paperback version of The Stand. However, no one loved lead like the Romans. They used it for everything, from ammo for their slings to the pipes in their famous plumbing systems. In fact, the Latin name for lead is plumbum, hence the chemical symbol Pb. Someone who worked with lead would be called a plumarius, which over time evolved into plumber. The Romans had their own really stupid way to use lead, though. During the fermentation of grapes, a chemical called acetic acid is produced. This is also the key ingredient in vinegar. When acetic acid and lead come in contact, they make lead acetate, also known as sugar of lead. So the Romans would make wines and grape syrups in lead pots to make the resulting product sweeter. Lead acetate still causes lead poisoning, though. Although we aren't actually that much smarter, because lead acetate was used in hair dye till 2004 in Europe and 2022 in the US. In the Middle Ages, lead began to be used for roofing as well as creating stained glass. When you look at a stained glass window, the lines that separate the colors of glass are called came and are often made of lead. It is still used in stained glass regularly because it is not a huge issue as long as you resist the urge to tongue down Jesus. The crazy thing is that at least some people throughout history knew that lead was toxic. In 370 BC, the Greek physician Hippocrates noticed stomach issues in metal workers. In 14 BC, the Roman architect Vitruvius talked about it in his book De Architectura, that he thought the lead pipes were poisoning the water. Around that same time, another Greek physician named Dioscorides wrote about lead causing cognitive issues and paralysis. We have reports of lead being used as an intentional poison as far back as the 1600s, but at the same time, people were still making plates and pots out of lead. Benjamin Franklin wrote about the dangers of lead as well. Lead use fell off greatly after the fall of the Roman Empire, but interest was renewed with the invention of the printing press. Due to lead being cheap and easy to work with, it became a popular material for the blocks used in the printing press. Benjamin Franklin, who worked around printing presses for almost his whole life, noted that people that worked with the lead would end up with muscle control issues. He also spoke about people drinking rainwater off roofs covered in soot from smelters probably wasn't good. In regards to this, he said, "You will observe with concern how a long, useful truth may be known and exist before it is generally received and practiced on." So let's move on to how the US became the largest consumer of lead in history. The things that spur the most innovation in this world are sex and war. So it's unsurprising what one of the first uses for lead to get industrialized was. If you ever watched the movie The Patriot, you might remember the scenes where Mel Gibson's character melts his son's lead toy soldiers to make musket balls. Aside from the toy soldier part, this was a very common way of making a musket ball at that time. You would just melt some lead and pour it into a mold, till 1782 when a plumber in Bristol named William Watts invented a much faster way of making musket balls and shot. He created the unimaginatively named shot tower. The way these work is the shot tower itself is just a tall, mostly hollow tube that was usually made of brick. At the top of the tower, some lead would be heated up to melting point and then poured onto a sieve that was over the hole. The sieve would split the lead into droplets around the desired size, and as they fall, the air resistance would make them round and cool so that the lead would harden before it hit a basin of water on the ground. They would then take them out of the water and inspect them, and anything that wasn't good enough went back up to get melted again. Also, the larger the shot you wish to make, the taller the tower needs to be so the balls will harden. Because this process was pretty easy and produced a product that everyone wanted, there are tons of unused shot towers all over the world. My favorite that I saw looking into this is Coop's Shot Tower in Melbourne. This tower has a mall built around it, where the tower is the focal point of the traditional Australian Thunderdome. Over time, the shot towers became less useful. Now a shot is usually just made by stamping lead into a ball or by squirting it into a liquid and letting it roll down an incline while under liquid. This is called the Bleimeister method. Lead is a good material for shot and bullets due to its density and its cheapness. In rifled weapons, the softness of lead is also beneficial because it helps grab into the rifling. For those who don't know what rifling is, it is a set of spiraling grooves that are in most modern pistols and rifles. The rifling causes the bullet to spin, which helps with its stability. There have been calls for lead to be removed from ammunition used in hunting and target shooting. On top of the concerns about lead building up in the ground, it has been found that while shooting, a significant amount of lead dust is expelled into the air. At minimum, better ventilation should probably be required at indoor ranges. There is a study on it below. During the Industrial Revolution and into modern day, lead found many new uses. Likely the most damaging use for lead was its addition to gasoline. In the 1920s, a team of General Motors engineers revealed that adding tetraethyl lead could prevent engine knock. Engine knock happens when some of the gas that was squirted into the engine cylinder does not ignite at the same time as the fuel that was ignited by the spark plug. That can cause a secondary explosion in the cylinder at the wrong time, which can cause damage to the engine. The octane rating you see on the gas pump relates to how likely the fuel is to cause knocking. The higher the number, the less likely to knock. Tetraethyl lead increased this rating and was one of the first octane boosters. The factories that made tetraethyl lead had a high rate of death and of the workers basically going crazy. Around 300 workers from the 3 plants were committed to mental institutions. This use was one of the main causes of lead contamination in the soil and water. Countries started phasing out tetraethyl lead in the 1970s, and in 2021, Algeria became the last country to stop selling it for use in road cars. That does not mean it is completely gone, however. Avgas, which is the fuel used in piston airplanes, is still leaded. One of lead's biggest uses has to do with lead's high attenuation coefficient. This means that it is hard for many kinds of energy to pass through lead. Because of this, lead is often used for many different kinds of shielding. Many recording studios use lead sheets between layers of foam in their soundproofing setups. Lead is often used for radiation shielding in a variety of places ranging from nuclear reactors to the vests you see X-ray techs wear. These kinds of uses are probably some of the least likely to be replaced, since they are contained away from the public and hard to replace. A nuclear reactor is not a place for children. A lot of electrical cables around the world have a lead sheath that was extruded around them to protect them. It was used because it is easy to extrude a continuous lead sheath around the cabling to keep water out as well as give a little physical protection. This is starting to be phased out because of worries over the lead waste it creates when the cable is replaced, and because the plastic alternatives are getting better and they are lighter. Lead solder is still fairly commonly used in electronics, although its use is starting to wane. Next, we have by far the most common use in lead today: batteries. Lead-acid batteries were the first kind of battery we created that could be recharged. The way a lead-acid battery works is you start with a container of sulfuric acid. In one side of the container, you put some lead to act as an anode, also known as the negative side. The electrons will flow out of to a lead dioxide cathode on the other side of the acid container, known as the positive, where it then flows into the system it is connected to. During this process, the sulfur in the acid bonds with the lead and makes lead sulfate on the 2 plates. To have the battery make more power, just add more of these anode-cathode pairs. Over time, this waters down the acid and makes the reaction within the battery less potent. However, you push current in the opposite direction, the lead and sulfur split up, recharging the battery. This is not a perfect process though, and over time, some of the lead sulfate becomes a crystalline structure that no longer goes back to its previous state, leaving the battery unable to charge. Compared to newer battery types like lithium and nickel metal hydride, lead acid batteries have a fairly short life cycle, often lasting for only about 200 charge cycles, where the others are capable of over 1,000. Lead acid batteries also have a tendency to just die for good if they are completely depleted. Lead acid batteries also have pretty poor energy density, and they are heavy since they are filled with lead and a liquid almost twice as heavy as water. Their 2 main advantages are that they are cheap and good at providing a surge current, which is when something electrical needs a lot of current for a short moment. This is why their most common usage is in internal combustion cars. The starter motor that kicks on when you turn the key in your ignition can draw a few thousand watts depending on what engine you have, but only does so for a few seconds or preferably less. This usage also minimizes their life cycle issues because they only have to discharge to start the car and for things like lights and maintaining the computer memory when the engine is off. Once the engine is on, the alternator takes over and charges the battery and provides electricity where it is needed. Lead-acid batteries are also sometimes used for power backups to keep lights and water pumps working in an emergency. They are also used in uninterruptible power supplies that you can buy to stop your computer from turning off immediately when the power goes out, so you have time to save the Ghost X Skeletor fanfiction that you have been working on. Lastly, lead often shows up in places it shouldn't. Be careful buying cheap no-name products such as plates and toys online because it is a fairly common occurrence that things like this could still have lead paint on them. Products on places like Wish and Temu are often made in factories that even the country they are in does not know about. If the price is too good to be true, it probably is. Be careful. That's all I have for you today. Socials, song list, and additional reading is in the description. Have a good day and eat something good.
Welcome to the Tree Zone. Today I'm going to give you some funky tree knowledge to sprout in your brain forest. We're going to go over some of the most interesting kinds of trees from all over the world. Let's get into it.
First up, we have this beautiful chungus of a tree known as the baobab. They are a genus of 8 tree species native to Africa and Australia. They are among the longest lived trees. One individual that died in 2011 was found to be about 2,400 years old. But let's get to what you're thinking. Why it looked like that? The baobab is thicker than Brock Lesnar's neck due to water. The areas where these trees live tend to have water scarcity issues. This has led the trees to evolve to be able to hold thousands of gallons of water in their trunks. They're able to do this because their wood is much less dense than other trees, allowing it to hold more water, kind of like a sponge. Because of this though, if they lose too much water, their weak, porous wood can collapse without the water there to hold them up. This has led them to have very thick trunks and hard calcium-rich bark to help support themselves. Even still, if these trees get too dry, they will collapse. In recent years, there's been a large die-off of these trees, and the leading theory seems to be dehydration due to climate change. Also, some of the baobabs produce fruit. Interestingly, the Australian baobab fruit is supposed to taste a bit like sherbet or citrus. Fun fact, Reese's peanut butter cups and lime sherbet go together way better than they have any right to. Many baobab species are considered endangered because they have been cut down for agricultural use and they are slow growing. Next tree! The manchineel tree is native to the Caribbean and much of its surrounding coasts. Looks like a pretty normal tree, right? Wrong. This tree is also known by another name, Manzanilla de la Muerte. For the less Espanol-inclined viewers, that means Little Apple of Death. The manchineel is filled with a toxic white sap that can cause numerous health issues, including blisters. Kind of like Charlie Sheen. The sap is present everywhere in the tree, including its fruit, which kind of look like little crab apples. If you stand under the tree in the rain, it can cause skin irritation. If you burn the wood, the smoke can cause damage to your eyes. If you eat the fruits, your throat will swell and your guts will bleed. While this is happening, the black-spined iguana will laugh at your weakness as it happily eats the fruit and sleeps in the tree. They are chill like that. The tree was also used to poison arrows by some of the indigenous people, which helped one bow user score a damage over time kill on Spanish raid boss Juan Ponce de Leon. No one is known to have died from eating the fruit in recent history, but if you see a crab apple on the beach, I would still avoid eating it. The manchineel is currently listed as endangered in Florida because of loss of habitat and because people understandably do not want poisonous trees in their yard. Next tree! Next up, we got the Indian banyan tree, which shocker lives in India and the surrounding countries. The Indian banyan is interesting because the more you learn about it, the more it seems like an eldritch god. It is part of a group of plants known as the strangler figs. This term has to do with how the tree grows. A banyan tree starts as a seed like most plants. The seed can germinate just about anywhere, including on another tree. The young tree will then wrap itself around its host and grow vine-like tendrils that will attempt to reach the ground. Once the tendrils touch the ground, they will develop roots and expand and keep branching out and make more tendrils that go into the ground. These trees can snuff out the trees in an area and continue to grow till they take up thousands of square meters of land with thousands of roots that have grown from branches to the ground. Some of these larger banyans can look like a one-tree forest. The trees are considered sacred by many in India, and there are often temples built near large banyan trees. There are famous banyans in India, such as the Great Banyan and Kabirvad, that are landmarks in their area. There is also the Lahaina banyan tree in Maui, which was gifted to the area in the 1870s by Indian missionaries. The tree was severely damaged in recent wildfires that went through Lahaina, but has started to show new growth. The tree will probably lose 20% of its previous mass, but should grow back. Maybe this toughness is part of why the Indian banyan tree is not considered threatened. Next tree!
You will all become one.
The quaking aspen is a common tree in much of North America. Sometimes it is also called the trembling aspen or the trembling poplar. The reason it has all these wiggly ass names is because the tree's leaves are very mobile when the wind gets blowing. This is because they have very flexible petioles, which is our word of the day. A petiole is the stalk that connects a leaf to the plant. You may be thinking, okay, what's weird about them? They're just a white tree. Well, what is interesting about these aspens is when you see a group of them in the woods, you may not be seeing a group. See, these aspens are almost like the opposite of the banyans we just talked about. Where the banyan goes from the air down into the ground, the aspen spreads through the ground and then comes up into the air. When you see a grove of aspens, that is usually just one organism. Each grove is a clonal colony where all their roots are connected. If you are somewhere with aspens near fall, you can actually spot the different colonies. All the trees in one colony will change their leaves at the same time. So sometimes the mountain can look kind of splotchy because the different colonies are at different stages in color. One aspen known as Pando is believed to be the largest organism on Earth and one of the oldest. Pando takes up 106 acres and has about 47,000 trunks above the ground. Each of those trunks is a clone that only lives to be about 100 years old, but it is believed that the root system could be up to 14,000 years old. Other species of clonal trees are believed to be even older. The Antarctic beech and the Wollemi pines in Australia are possibly tens of millions of years old. It hasn't been confirmed yet, but it is possible that some of the fossils of trees in the area of the Wollemi pines could be previous clones of the living tree. The quaking aspen and the Antarctic beech are not currently considered threatened. But the Wollemi pine is considered to be critically endangered because it had been believed extinct till a grove was discovered in the 90s. Next tree. Right now you may be thinking, Bob, why are you showing me Charlie Brown's Christmas tree? Well, respect your damn elders because that ugly busted ass tree is one of the oldest living organisms in the world. Bristlecone pines are 3 species of trees that live in the American Southwest. They are believed to be the longest lived trees, excluding the clonal trees we just talked about. One bristlecone pine in California named Methuselah has been verified as being over 4,800 years old. These trees grow high in the mountains just below the tree line in soils that most other plants aren't interested in. This lack of competition is very helpful for them because they grow extremely slowly. There have been reports of 40-year-old trees that were only 15 centimeters tall. Even their leaves are long-lived. Some of these trees have been found just sitting there with needles on them that are over 45 years old. Bristlecones have very dense wood, which is filled with resin, and this makes them very tough. It also makes them very susceptible to fires because resin is extra flammable. The age of these trees has been very helpful for climate scientists. See, the rings on a tree are fatter or thinner depending on how much water the tree gets. These trees give scientists a way to see the precipitation levels of a given area for thousands of years. Scientists can even get extra data from these trees because these trees have a tendency to just stay standing when they die and not rot for hundreds of years because they have tough wood and live in a dry climate. Future scientists will probably be able to do a similar thing with Keith Richards and Donatella Versace. Ain't nothing getting through that leather. The bristlecone does have a little bit of pizzazz though, because when their pine cones first come out, they're purple. These trees are currently under threat from mountain pine beetles and a fungus called the white pine blister rust. Because of those factors, plus fire danger, and the fact that it takes forever to grow one of these damn things, they are currently considered to be threatened. Thankfully, pretty much every grove of these trees is now in protected land, which means we don't have to worry about them getting cut down at least. Aside from when that one guy got his tool stuck in the oldest tree in the world and cut it down. Story and description. Next tree. Last we got the pretty patty of trees, the rainbow eucalyptus, which lives in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea. Fun fact, it is the only eucalyptus native to the northern hemisphere. These trees engage in technicolor shenanigans, where their somewhat normal brown bark peels off, and the newly exposed inner bark goes through a range of colors from green to blue to orange to red and yellow as their tree flesh reacts to the air. Something to be aware of with these trees when you look at pictures online is a lot of them have engaged in what is known as color saturation fuckery. This has become an overall issue with landscape and nature photography in general in the digital age, where everyone tries to make the mountain they took a picture of look like a stupid jelly bean. Here's a more naturally colored photo next to what generally gets posted online. Natively, they grow in rainforests, but because they are fun looking, they have been imported and planted in many other places. They are very frost intolerant though, so they can really only be planted in winterless places like the tropics or the southern US. Interestingly, this tree's main use besides being pretty is making paper. You're thinking, oh cool, is that how they make confetti? No! All the fun colors get drained out of it by the nasty ass chemicals that paper mills use, which is the reason why if you go by a paper mill, it always smells like shit. Its use of this would be fine in theory because it's a pretty fast growing tree, but in many places it is being clear cut faster than it is being planted. This has led to them being listed as a vulnerable species. However, they have become an invasive species in the US because they are outcompeting local trees. This is an even bigger issue than it sounds because the rainbow eucalyptus is less fire resistant than many native species, so their spread can increase forest fire danger. This leads me to something that is important to remember when you see a cool tree online, like in this video or on something like Pinterest. If you're looking for a tree to plant in your yard, the best choice will be something native. They are already adapted to the environment, so they will require less work. On top of that, the birds and wildlife in your area have evolved with it, so it will provide them a nice home. Also, if you do some Googling for your area, you can often find programs that will either give you a native tree, or in some areas give you a rebate on your water bill or some other thing. I put a link in the additional reading section below that has some info on planting native trees. That's all I got for you. Have a good day, and eat something good.
Are you ready to talk about Panthera?
You see, some people try to lump in other large cats such as cheetahs and cougars as big cats, but we are sticking with the traditional definition of big cats being members of the genus Panthera. Hashtag trad cats. So let's get to talking about the 5 members of Panthera: jaguars, leopards, snow leopards, lions, and tigers. Oh my. First up, we got the jaguar, or jaguar, if your country cannot settle on a single measurement system. Their original name is jaguara, which comes from the Tupi-Guarani family of languages, as do the words tapioca and petunia. The jaguar is the third largest big cat, ranging from 80 to 300 pounds and about 4 foot long to 6 foot long, not counting the tail. The largest recorded jaguar weighed 328 pounds. Their range goes from the southwestern US down throughout Central America and into northern South America. Historically, they had a much larger range, going further north into the US and as far east as Louisiana, and covering most of Central and South America down to about the midway point of Argentina. Having said that, some of you may be surprised at the inclusion of the US in their territory. They were fairly common in their original range, but many were killed during Western expansion until they became locally extinct. Recently, though, they have started coming back on their own by crossing over the border from Mexico. There are growing populations in New Mexico and Arizona, and their conservation is being monitored by US Fish and Wildlife south of Interstate 10. As recently as the 90s, there were 8 subspecies of jaguars in the world, but now there's just 1. Because genetic testing has shown that jaguars are not different enough to have subspecies. Jaguars usually live to be 12 to 15 years old, although one jaguar in a zoo in Croatia lived to be 29 years old. Jaguars were often used as a symbol in religions in the Americas prior to colonization. Art of jaguars has been found from civilizations in Peru to the Mayans to the Anasazi to the mound builders in Missouri. In the additional reading section, I put an interesting article about why the mound builders had jaguar art. Famously, jaguars also come in the limited edition skin known as Black Panthers. Their lovely blackness is caused by an inherited trait called melanism, which is kind of the opposite of albinism. In melanism, there is more melanin than normal. In albinism, there is an absence of melanin. Something that makes jaguars not like the other cats is how they kill their prey. See, other cats kill their prey by biting the neck of the other animal. Jaguars, on the other hand, have the strongest jaws amongst cats, which allows them to kill their prey by biting their head and crushing it. This also allows them to include turtles in their diet. They also eat pretty much any other animal they find, including everything from the capybara to the caiman to the deer. Jaguars are also good swimmers, which makes sense because they live in the rainforest. They have even been documented swimming to catch fish. Interestingly, they are not generally aggressive towards humans. The first officially documented fatal jaguar attack in Brazil happened in 2008. I also found a study that found that from 2010 to 2021, there were only 5 attacks in Brazil. All of these were non-fatal, and all were from the jaguar being surprised when someone got close to their food or their babies. Jaguars are considered near threatened. They are dealing with habitat loss, poaching, and conflicts with humans. Pretty much all large predators face some level of threat from conflict with humans. Common examples are them coming into urban areas and having to be put down, or being shot for preying on livestock. Hunting jaguars is banned in much of their range, and there are a number of sanctuaries set up for them. Their total population is believed to have declined in recent years, although it is growing in Mexico and the US. Next up, we got spotted boy number 2, the leopard. Leopards are the smallest of the big cats. They normally range from 46 to 165 pounds and 3 to 6 feet long, not counting the tail. They are very slender compared to other big cats. They are kind of twinkish. They live to be 12 to 17 years old, and one female black leopard in Texas named Raven lived to be 25. Let's have the spot conversation. You can tell the difference between leopards and jaguars by the fact that leopard rosettes are made of closely packed dots, where the jaguars are a bit looser and have a dot in the middle of the rosette. The markings are a form of camouflage. When they move through the forest in the shadows, the spots help break up their form. There can also be melanistic leopards just like there are jaguars, and they are also called black panthers. If you run into a spotted cat in the wild, you can tell the difference because they don't live on the same continent. The leopard is native to Africa and Asia. Also, I went down the rabbit hole of why is leopard print considered trashy. Wearing leopard was often a sign of royalty, and in the 20th century when fabric printing became easier, leopard print became popular. Dior had an old leopard print show in the 40s, and Jackie Kennedy often wore it, as did other members of high society. It seems like it started as a symbol for women's empowerment, and then Hollywood put every character that is supposed to be a slutty mom in leopard print. Eventually, this lowered its perceived status. Throughout their range, leopards generally prefer to eat whatever grazing animals are around, although they have been known to eat everything from jackals to birds to dung beetles. There are 9 living subspecies of leopard according to DNA testing. In case you are wondering how the testing works, here is a quick simplified explanation. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. The DNA in your mitochondria is most likely identical to the DNA in the mitochondria of your mother and grandmother. It usually takes many generations for any real changes to occur, and this fact can be used to find if populations of animals have grown apart. The most common subspecies is the African leopard, which is the one you see in the nature documentaries eating gazelles in the trees of the savannah. There is also the Arabian leopard, which lives on the Arabian Peninsula and is the smallest leopard. There's also the Indian leopard that lives in India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan, and has a smaller frame than the African leopard, but is generally more muscly. Finally, there's the Sri Lankan leopard, which is just in Sri Lanka and has an interesting feeding habit. One of the things leopards are known for is that they take their kill up in the tree to eat it. The Sri Lankan leopard does not bother with this because there aren't any other predators there that are big enough to bother it. There is the Indo-Chinese leopard that lives in Southeast Asia and southern China. The skinny part of Thailand is called the Kra Isthmus. In a study, all of the leopards found south of this isthmus were black, possibly because it helps them blend in better in the dense jungles in that area. The Java leopard lives on just the island of Java. Interestingly, Sumatra and Borneo sit between Java and the mainland, but neither of those islands are believed to have had leopard populations in many thousands of years, possibly due to predators living on those islands. Also, before you come at me, yes, they have clouded leopards. That is not the same thing. Look at it. I have seen house cats bigger than the clouded leopard. The North Chinese leopard lives in northern China. Their special trait is that their rosettes are just black spots. The Amur leopard lives along the Russia and China border just above North Korea. They are believed to be the rarest big cat, with right around 100 of them left in the wild. It is believed that most of the population is in Russia, although there might also be a few in North Korea. I wonder if they like Dennis Rodman. And lastly, the Persian leopard. It ranges from Turkey to Pakistan. It's even in Balochistan. The Persian leopard is also the largest subspecies, getting up to 6 feet long and 155 pounds. Leopards are kind of in the middle as far as attacks on humans go. They attack more than jags and snow leopards, but not as many as lions and tigers. Despite being all over the place, they only attack about 50 people a year, and because they are kind of scrawny, there have been quite a few cases of human beings beating leopards in fights, even the elderly. Leopards are considered vulnerable as a whole, but certain subspecies such as the Amur leopard are critically endangered. Next up, we got the snow leopard. They are also commonly called the ounce. This apparently comes from the word once, which is an old French word for lynx. Whatever Frenchmen decided to call them that must have had too much wine, because they don't really look alike. They live to be 15 to 18 years old in the wild, and one snow leopard lived to be 26 years old in a Tokyo zoo. They live in the mountainous areas of Central Asia, from the Himalayas up through China and Mongolia to Siberia. Until recently, the snow leopard was not considered to have subspecies, but some DNA testing has shown that the species can be broken up into subspecies by whether they are in the northern, western, or central populations. This is apparently somewhat controversial though, as the differences between them are small. Another thing DNA testing has told us about snow leopards is that their closest living relative is actually the tiger. Since they live high in the mountains, their diet is a bit more limited than that of other big cats. They can get ibex and a goat-like animal called the tar, but also end up eating a lot of smaller animals like rodents and birds. In a way, the snow leopard is a paradoxical leopard, as it is neither smaller nor bigger than the normal leopard. Female snow leopards are usually 77 pounds to 88 pounds, where the regular female leopards are 46 to 132 pounds. Males are 99 pounds up to the biggest known wild snow leopard named the Dude, who weighs 119 pounds. Male regular leopards are 80 pounds and up to one leopard recorded in South Africa that was 212 pounds. This illustrates the differences between an animal like the snow leopard that lives in one general region versus the regular leopard that covers a large chunk of the earth. The normal leopard has evolved to various environments, leading to a much larger difference between different populations, where the snow leopard is fairly uniform. That means that with things like climate change or disease, we are much more likely to hold on to something like the leopard than the snow leopard, since it's much more likely that at least one subspecies can adapt. Agriculture has found this out time and time again. The Irish potato famine was partially due to the near universal use of the Irish lumper variety of potato. As soon as one disease was able to kill them, it wiped out all the potatoes in the area. A similar thing happened with the Gros Michel banana that the artificial banana flavor is based on. They have a number of cold weather adaptations, including fur that can be close to 5 inches thick and a very stocky build. Having shorter limbs is an advantage in colder climates, as it helps conserve heat since it reduces the amount of blood circulating outside of the animal's core. My favorite feature of theirs is that they have a very fat tail, and it is used to store fat and keep their face warm when they sleep. Interestingly, they are the only member of Panthera that cannot roar. This is because their vocal folds are too short. Due to them living in the mountains, they are excellent jumpers and climbers. They also have big paws for their size, and that helps them keep on top of the snow like snowshoes. They are also the least aggressive of the big cats. The only confirmed attack on humans was by a toothless rabid one in Kyrgyzstan. They are listed as a vulnerable species. They are facing threats from habitat loss and poaching for use in traditional medicine. I assure you that I ain't lying when I say the next cat is the lion. You already know that they live in groups called prides. What you may not have realized is that they are the only big cat that lives in groups. As far as I can find, the only other feline that lives in groups are feral house cats. Lions are considered to have two subspecies, the northern lion and the southern lion. This is confusing because the northern lion is in Western Africa, Central Africa, and India. Historically, there were lions in Northern Africa, but they were wiped out by the 60s. The lions that live in India are also known as Asiatic lions. Historically, their range went from India across the Middle East to Turkey and possibly into Europe. It is very possible that the lions in Greek mythology would have been inspired by Asiatic lions. Today, they just live in Gir National Park in India. Lions are our biggest kitties yet. The female lion is usually about 5 to 6 feet long without the tail and 240 to 315 pounds. The males are usually 6 to 7 feet long without the tail and range from 350 to 500 pounds. There was a male at the Dublin Zoo in the 50s that got up to 827 pounds. These southern lions are a bit bigger than the northern ones and also live in bigger groups and generally have larger manes. The females do the bulk of the hunting while the males stay home and protect the turf. Males sometimes do help with the hunting if they have a chance at a big score, like a water buffalo or an elephant. The diet of lions is mostly the large animals in their area like wildebeest and gazelle, plus little stuff like rodents and lizards they find by chance. Let's talk about their defining feature though. Their sweet dew. The working theory for why male lions have manes is to stunt for the girls. Not all male lions have manes though. Males that have been seriously injured or castrated will lose their mane. There are also some populations of lions that just don't grow them. This is where two of the most famous lions in history lived. They were known as the Tsavo man-eaters. In 1889, a railroad was being built from Uganda to the Kenyan port of Mombasa. Two male lions began to take workers from their tents in the night. Between March and December of that year, the two lions were believed to have killed somewhere between a few dozen and over 100 men. The workers tried everything at their disposal. They built walls, they had lookouts, but men were still being dragged into the brush to never be seen again. The lions were eventually killed by John Henry Patterson, who was hired by the rail company to kill them. John Henry Patterson is also the most British man I've ever seen in my life. The Tsavo man-eaters are on exhibit as taxidermy at the Fields Museum in Chicago. And look, they have no manes. It is possible that these two started eating so many people due to a virus called rinderpest, killing off many of the herbivores in the area. It may have also had to do with one of the lions having an infected tooth, which would have made hunting hard. Although humans are not a main food source for lions, they do attack somewhat often. Record keeping seems inconsistent, but the most common number I saw was around 200 people killed by lions per year. That said, don't think of lions as horrible monsters or anything. Deer also kill about 200 people a year in just the US. A big part of the lion's large kill count on humans is where they live. Animal attacks are more common in poorer parts of the world due to lack of infrastructure. Due to centuries of exploitation by Western powers, the residents of places like Africa and India are more likely to live in undeveloped areas. This leads to a higher risk of deadly encounters with animals. And before I get some dumbass in the comments going on about how they go camping all the time and haven't gotten eaten, there's a huge difference between an established campsite or hiking trail at a state or national park and walking through the actual middle of nowhere. The noise from all the people at a busy campground is a huge deterrent to animals coming near the campers there. Anytime you go in the backwoods, there's a possibility of an animal encounter, and many people in places like Africa and India have to do it just to get water. Just to be clear, not all of Africa and India have this issue. Places like Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Delhi, and Mumbai are perfectly modern cities. We are talking about rural areas. Lions are considered a vulnerable species. They're facing threats from running into humans, their prey dying out, habitat loss, poaching, and climate change. It's liger time! The liger is the child of a male lion and a female tiger. There's also the tigon, whose parents are a male tiger and a female lion. The liger is believed to be the biggest living cat, with one in Wisconsin named Nook having been recorded at 1,200 pounds. There is no recorded instance of a liger being made in the wild, and there are only around 100 of them in the world right now. The breeding of ligers is decreasing due to concerns about their health. Hybrid animals like ligers and tigons are very prone to health issues. This is because when you mix DNA from two different species, things don't always go together right. There are other hybrids between members of Panthera as well. They include things like the leopon and the jag lion. Hybrids are thought to happen exclusively in captivity. Some are bred to be an attraction for a zoo, and some happen accidentally when different species are left together in captivity. Lastly, we got the tiger. Tigers are the largest natural big cat. It is possible that if you look over the whole species of the average size though, lions could be slightly bigger. Similar to the leopard versus snow leopard discussions, lions have a more uniform size due to having just 2 subspecies, while tigers have 6 and live in a wide range of environments. They live up to 15 years in the wild and into the mid-20s in captivity. Tigers largely eat big herbivores like deer, boar, and buffalo. They've also been known to eat things like monkeys, leopards, bears, and even crocodiles. However, tigers are not known to enjoy sugary cereal. In fact, cats of all kinds have little to no ability to taste sweetness. Tigers can range from the small female Sumatran tiger weighing 165 pounds to the large male Siberian tiger being close to 700 pounds and being 10 feet long. One Siberian tiger named Jaipur was 10 foot 11 inches long and 932 pounds. Their habitat ranges from India to Southeast Asia up through China to Siberia. Let's start with the Bengal tiger. They live in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, China, and Bhutan. They're the most common tiger. They are the kind of default tiger that you think of when you think of a tiger. It is also what Shere Khan and Richard Parker would have been. The Sumatran tiger lives in Sumatra. They are the smallest of the living subspecies. It is believed that their smallness is due to what is called insular dwarfism. This is a phenomenon that has been observed where large animals that live on an island will get smaller over generations. Sumatra is also home to the smallest rhino, which is just called the Sumatran rhino. Next up is the Indo-Chinese tiger and the Malayan tiger. They both live in Southeast Asia, and they are very similar, except the Malayan tiger is a little smaller. They are a darker orange than the other tigers as well. Next up we have the South China tiger, which may be the most likely big cat to go extinct, aside from maybe the Amur leopard. It is believed to already be already extinct in the wild, and there are only about 200 left in captivity. Last, we have the Siberian tiger. It is the largest subspecies and lives mostly in the east coast of Russia. These tigers have been known to drag brown bears out of their dens during hibernation to eat them. The tiger's stripes play the same role as the rosettes we talked about earlier. The stripes break up their form and make them harder to spot in the tall grass. White tigers are the result of a mutation and are not albino. It's actually a very rare mutation that only 0.001% of tigers carry. That means that more than likely every white tiger you have ever seen is inbred. Everyone had them on their binder because they thought they were magical, when really they were the cat version of Charles II of Spain. Somewhere around 55 people are killed by tigers each year. There is a place along the India-Bangladesh border called Sundarbans, which is where a significant amount of those attacks happen. It is a mangrove area that has about 100 Bengal tigers living in it. Prior to the 1980s, the tigers there regularly killed over 20 people a year. Sometimes more than 60 deaths were recorded in the area. Strangely, the tigers were not sick and seemed to just view humans as prey, just like any other animal. Fishermen have even been attacked on their boats by the tigers that swam out to them. The attacks have gone down over the years though, thanks to new management techniques like radio tracking. Tigers as a whole are considered endangered, and subspecies like the South China tiger are critically endangered. A main issue for tigers is that so many of them have been captured to be kept in captivity. There are 4,000 to 5,000 tigers in the wild, and 5,000 tigers in Texas. There are also believed to be 8,000 in captivity in Asia and about 1,600 in Europe. They also face threats from habitat loss, climate change, and traditional medicine. Something to remember after this video is that predators like big cats can be dangerous, but it's also dangerous to let them die. Without predators to help control the population of herbivores, their populations can get out of control and it can cause damage to the environment. It can even lead to the herbivores starving to death or experiencing pandemics. Well, that's all I have for you. Hope you have a good day and eat something good.
My name is Bob Ratman, attorney at Rat Law. Today, I'm going to educate you on some strange laws from around the world so that you don't fall prey to them.
Or, just try to entertain you for a little while. Most of these are kind of silly. I skipped some of the more famous ones, like it being illegal to have an ice cream cone in your back pocket in Alabama, or handling salmon in suspicious circumstances in the UK. I could also probably do a whole video on Singapore. So let's get going with the jurisprudence shenanigans. Our first law takes us to the quaint little French town of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. By the way, Châteauneuf-du-Pape translates to Pope's New Castle, which is the big building in the middle. Look, it was new in the 1300s and only one pope lived there. Go easy on it. But forget about the Pope Palace, because what we are worried about happened in the 1950s. Because in 1954, they passed one of the most xenophobic laws I've ever heard of. The first section of this law states, the overflight, the landing, and the takeoff of aircraft known as flying saucers or flying cigars, whatever their nationality is, are prohibited on the territory of the community. That's right, they banned aliens. The law also goes on to give the city police and forest officers the ability to seize the alien spacecraft. How are they supposed to do that? I don't know. You might be sitting there thinking, is this yet another case of the French getting ergot in their bread? Well, there's no hard evidence of that, but the law was a reaction to a wave of UFO sightings in the area, including one guy that claimed to see little men in spacesuits in his yard. France seems like a dangerous place for aliens to go walking around. Usually when the French find strange creatures in their yard, they cook them in butter. Officially, the reason for making this law was to protect the local vineyards from aliens and people trying to look for aliens. There's also a pretty good chance it was a publicity stunt. Some of my information for this came from a New York Times clipping from the time, so it probably worked to some extent. Next law. Next, we got one that may surprise my European viewers. If you were to ask an American if they like blackcurrant, they would probably respond, "What the hell is that?" For those that don't know, blackcurrant is a berry that is pretty common in Europe and parts of Asia. It kind of tastes like a cross between a cherry and a grape, but with more acidity. It is actually a pretty common flavor for sweet things in Europe. In the UK, Skittles are actually blackcurrant flavored instead of grape. However, blackcurrant was banned in the US in 1912. You may be thinking, what, did an American kid choke on a blackcurrant like the Kinder Eggs? But no, they actually had a good reason this time. You see, blackcurrant, the other currants, and gooseberries belong to a group called ribes. Ribes are a secondary host for white pine blister rust, which is a fungus that can kill some species of pine trees. So the US Department of Agriculture effectively banned ribes in the US to protect the US lumber industry as part of the Plant Quarantine Act of 1912. The white pine blister rust is not as much of an issue in Europe and Asia because a lot of the pine trees there are resistant. In the 1960s though, the federal government lifted the ban on ribes thanks to the Forest Service's work on breeding resistance into their pine trees. However, state bans bans took longer to be repealed. Many bans lasted into the 2000s, and some still aren't repealed. There are also still some federal restrictions on what countries the plant can be imported from. Despite blackcurrant's newfound legality, it hasn't recovered as a consumer product in the US. Being banned for decades means that it largely fell out of the public consciousness. It was replaced with local fruits and easily attainable tropical fruits. You can find some blackcurrant products in the US, mostly jam and jelly, but nowhere near the selection of commercial products that there are in Europe. If you go on Amazon in the US and search blackcurrant, most of what you get is imported things like Ribena selling for $19 for 1.5 liters. I did find some blackcurrant Twinnings tea, which I will report my findings on social media when it shows up. Next law! Next up, we are going to China. In 2016, China's Ministry of Culture created an interesting regulation for live streaming sites. They restricted eating bananas on stream. What kind of monkey business is this, you might ask? The answer is pretty simple. Porn is not legal in China. In fact, the Chinese government has likened porn to spiritual pollution. It is also illegal in most Asian countries. This map shows places where it is legal in green, yellow has restrictions, or is in a gray area, and red is illegal. Granted, China does have a porn industry, but it exists underground and in loopholes. So because of this, many enterprising ladies were streaming themselves eating bananas slowly to screens in goon caves across China. In recent years, though, they have gotten even stricter on live streams. The new rules include broad statements like illegal or vulgar content cannot be spread. They also have to dress and speak appropriately, again a very loose term. I imagine this allows them to get rid of anyone they find at all inappropriate at this point. They do have one good rule though, and that is if you make content that gives things like medical advice or financial advice in China, you have to be licensed. I have lightly touched on medical things in some of my videos, but never in an advice way. That's not ethical. I have an associate's in funeral science. I'm not an expert in anything. I just like reading and learning and telling people about what I found. My goal is just to make interesting videos that make people laugh. Let's be real, 99% of creators should not be aiming much higher than that. If you need life advice that is more life-altering than what cars you should test drive, go find a real-life professional. Finance and medical content is full of scammers at this point. Hell, there are people like CoffeeZilla and How to Cook That who have whole careers talking about the dumb shit people try to push on their viewers. China has some bad things going on, but there are a few things I think we could learn from them. Cracking down on at least the notable online scammers is one of them. Next law. Next up, we have Quentin Tarantino's least favorite law. In 2009, Greece banned wearing high heels at certain historical sites like the Acropolis. This is another one that has a good reason. High heels are more likely to damage floors than other common types of shoes. This is mainly due to the wearer's weight being distributed over a smaller area. This makes them much more likely to scratch, scuff, and dent floors. For instance, I found a Canadian study about stiletto heels and flooring. It says that linoleum can take about 75 psi and that vinyl tile can take about 200 psi. On the other hand, it measured the pressure exerted by heels worn by 12 of their co-workers. The heels exerted between 640 psi and over 2200 psi. I've also seen historical buildings in the US that discourage high heels. I live in New Mexico, and a lot of the older buildings here and in other mountain states have floors that are just boards made out of the nearest pine trees over joists. I have heard multiple stories over the years of people wearing high heels, stepping just right, and their heel pops the knot out of the historic building's floor. Not only does this damage the building, it is also possible that it will hurt the wearer. It is not a law, but it is something to keep in mind, and some buildings do request that people don't wear high heels to save the floors. It also seems like a very reasonable law, especially in a country whose economy relies heavily on its historic buildings. The Greece law also had a second part where they banned food and drink in these historic areas as well. When I was looking into this, I saw a report from around this time where they removed over 60 pounds of chewing gum from under the seats of the over 1800-year-old theater, the Odeon of Herodes Atticus. There's also an ongoing issue all over the world that one of the best ways to get people interested in history is getting them to see historic places. But this is also one of the worst things for historic places. Many historical sites have been damaged in the world, either intentionally or accidentally by people visiting them. So please, whenever you go to a historic place, try to be careful so that many more generations can see it. Next law! But your roads are world of tanks. In the United Kingdom, you can legally drive a tank on the road. Surprisingly, this is not really allowed in the US. There might be some local law I didn't find, but at least in general, that is true. You can own tanks in the US, but you cannot drive them on the road. There are plenty of places that let you drive tanks in the US, but you have to stay on private property. There are also tank-like things you can drive on the road in the US, like the Ferret and some other armored vehicles with tires, but in the UK, you can have a full-on tanky boy with tracks and drive it down to Nando's. There are a few rules you have to follow if you want to rommel about the English countryside, however. Obviously, the first one is the gun has to be disabled. It looks like a common way to do this is to fill the gun with concrete. Also, it is called a gun on tanks from what I found. Apparently in the modern military, cannons are rifled and a lot of times are artillery that fires in an arc to hit things beyond eyesight, where tanks have smoothbore guns that shoot directly at things. You also have to put rubber shoes on the tracks so it does not hurt the road. The tank you pick also also has to be less than 2.9 meters wide and less than 44 metric tons. By the way, a metric ton is 1,000 kilos as opposed to the 2,000 pounds used in the US. The conversion is a metric ton is about 1.1 freedom tons. Also, the width restriction prevents the coolest British tank from being street legal. You also need to get an H-class driver's license that allows you to drive track vehicles. Obviously, tanks are outnumbered by Vauxhall Astras in the UK, but it is interesting nonetheless, especially considering how narrow many of the roads are there. Look at how big a normal American truck looks on the country roads there. Overall, pretty surprising, since I thought the only thing they tanked over there was their economy by leaving the EU. Next law. Finally, we are going to the exotic land of cheese and alcoholism. Wisconsin. In the United States, there are laws known as employees' right to know laws or just right to know laws. In simple terms, these laws require employers to provide information to their workers about any dangers in the workplace. Wisconsin's version of this law has an interesting provision. Under the part of the law that deals with toxic substances, it lists what is not included as a toxic substance that needs to be disclosed. Most of these lines relate to federal rules or say things like substances that stay in a sealed package do not have to be disclosed. But then you get to the bottom of it and it just says lutefisk. If you are not from Wisconsin, Minnesota, or one of the Nordic countries, there's a pretty good chance you haven't heard this word before. You see, lutefisk is a traditional dish in the Nordic countries that is dried whitefish, like cod, that is then soaked in lye. Yes, that lye, the one used in soap making, the stuff they burn people with in Fight Club. Lutefisk is a horrifyingly gelatinous dish that smells awful. This line makes it so employers do not have to warn their employees about working with it, even though they would have to warn them about working with lye. Lutefisk is a fairly common food in Wisconsin and Minnesota due to a lot of immigrants from Norway settling there in the 1800s because it reminded them of their homeland. Cold and wet. It is bizarre to me to carve out a special exception for lutefisk at the potential risk of employee safety. Traditional foods are a great way to continue your heritage, but there are better Norwegian foods that don't require chemical exposure. My grandmother used to make another Norwegian food called lefse, and it is delicious. It's kind of like a potato tortilla, and if you slap some butter and some sugar on that bitch, you're gonna have a great time. Remember kids, say no to lutefisk. That's all I have for you today. Socials and additional reading are in the description, and I hope you have a great day and eat something good. When you think of tarantulas, do you think the middle of the United States? Well, you should, because they're kind of a tourist attraction. You see, this area is home to the Oklahoma brown tarantula, also known as the Missouri tarantula or the Texas brown tarantula. Everyone wants a piece of this colorful spider, and I'm gonna tell you why. They range from Colorado and New Mexico east to Missouri and Louisiana and down to the Mexico border. They're a pretty normal tarantula. They're brown. They're not particularly dangerous, although it would hurt to get bit by one since they can get to over 5 inches across. Some people say 5 inches is pretty big. But you see, the thing that makes them interesting is what they do when they start looking for love. Tarantulas. What I'm about to describe is sometimes called the tarantula migration, but they aren't really going anywhere, so it's not really migrating. It is sometimes called a mate creation, which is a fun word, so I'm going to use it. Let me explain to you what these fine, furry arachnids are actually up to. Our lovely brown tarantulas spend most of their life down in a hole, feeling so small. But for the males, that changes when they are somewhere between 6 to 10 years old. From July to October, these newly minted spider men will leave their burrows in search for a mate. Just for reference, the days that they're actually out vary a little from place to place and from what the weather is doing that year. They usually come out once it gets a little cooler and rainier. The male spiders will start to wander around the countryside sniffing for a female. Once the male picks up the scent of her pheromones, he'll go to that female's burrow. The male will then do a little dance where he taps on the webs at the entrance of her burrow with his pedipalps. By the way, pedipalps are the shorter legs by their fangs. When the males are ready to mate, they will make little packets of sperm wrapped in web and store them in their pedipalps. Fun! If the male barges into her house without doing the dance, or if his moves are weak, there's a good chance he will be eaten. If she likes what he's putting down, she will come out and welcome him into the den. The male will then take the web full of sperm he prepared earlier and try to put it in the female. If he is successful, she will use that sperm to make a lovely egg sac with as many as 1,500 pre-tarantulas in it. The male will then try to leave as quickly as possible because there is about a 20% chance that she will try to eat him. You'd be hungry too if you're trying to grow 1,500 little ones. The male may then go on to mate with as many as 100 other females during the season. This activity leads to the countryside being filled with a flurry of male tarantulas desperately looking for a hole. This has also led to this mating season becoming a bit of an attraction where people come to witness the tarantula rumspringa. La Junta, Colorado even has a tarantula fest with tarantula tours, food, crafts, and even a parade. California also has bronze tarantulas and black tarantulas that engage in a similar practice and have their own festivals. Unfortunately, the male tarantulas only get to enjoy the festivities once. they will die within a few months of mating. The females, on the other hand, can live upwards of 40 years. From what I was reading, we do not know for sure what their max age is, but 30 to 40 years seems pretty normal. If you want some job security on a grant, maybe try to see if you can start a study to raise one from birth to death. Should get you pretty close to retirement. That's all I have for you. I hope you have a great day, and I hope you eat something good. There are enough odd stories in my home state that aliens do not make an appearance in this, nor is there anything that's gone on at the national labs or anywhere else the white vans with flat windows go. I don't even have any meth heads in here. I went with 5 stories that have always just kind of stuck out in my head. If you guys like this video, I could do more. There's a lot of interesting New Mexico history that does not fit in this theme. We could cover things like Pope's Rebellion, the Battle of Glorieta, and the company mining towns. But enough yapping, let's get into it. We are going to kick it off with the New Mexico story. See, there is a piece of New Mexico history that is drilled into everyone that lives here, and it is about how this staircase was made. These stairs live in the Loreto Chapel in Santa Fe. The story goes that during the construction of the chapel in the late 1870s and early 1880s, there was a problem. They did not have plans for the stairs to get to the choir loft. Some sources say it's because the architect and possible Warhammer 40k character, Projectus Moly, died suddenly during construction. The nuns there, known as the Sisters of Loreto, approached multiple tradesmen to try and build stairs to the loft, but no one could come up with a way to do it that wouldn't take up too much space in the small chapel. The story goes that the nuns prayed for 9 days straight and a man appeared saying he could do it. And he did. Depending on the account, it either took him a night or more likely a few months. But either way, the Stairmaster delivered on his stair plan. What he built is very impressive even by today's standards. He made a spiral staircase with no glue, no nails, and more interestingly, no central pole for support. He then left without taking payment. The nuns claimed that the man must have been Saint Joseph. In case you did not realize this either, Saint Joseph is the Joseph that was a carpenter who married Mary. So let's go a bit
Deeper into this.
A common claim for the stairs is that they are not physically possible. They do make sense physics-wise though, because they are a helix instead of spiral, which adds strength to the staircase. Also, if you look, it now has some little metal braces from it to the walls near it. These were added in 1887 when they also put handrails on it. The handrails were added because apparently the nuns were scared to use the stairs. Supposedly they were going up and down on their hands and knees because in addition to not having handrails, it also tends to move like a spring when people are on it. Also, not having glue or nails was not a strange thing at the time. The 1870s were still fairly early into the Industrial Revolution, so nails were still kind of expensive, especially since Santa Fe was kind of in the middle of nowhere at the time. There are theories about the identity of the carpenter, including it being a French rancher that lived nearby, but as with most mysteries from history, it is hard to know for sure. No face, no case. All that said, whoever built it was a world-class carpenter, and it's weird that they were in New Mexico in the 1880s when it wasn't even a state. The design and craftsmanship is amazing. The stringers, which are the parts on either side of where you step, are made of wood that was bent in 2 directions in order to achieve the helix. Also, the wood is a type of spruce that has not been identified apparently, although I am not sure how hard they have tried to identify it. All in all, regardless of whether it was a gift from God, they are very pretty stairs. One of the more famous stories in New Mexico history is the Lincoln County War. It was a prolonged conflict between 2 store owners named James Dolan and John Tunstall. They organized armed groups to fight each other intermittently from 1878 to 1881. 23 people were killed, more were wounded. Tunstall's group included Billy the Kid, and the whole story has become pretty famous. The movie Young Guns is about the Lincoln County War, and there's a lot of other media that covers it. That is why we are not going over the whole story today. Instead, I am going to give you some strange information that is tangential to it. The territorial governor of New Mexico during the Lincoln County War was a man named Lew Wallace. Lew Wallace was in the Union Army during the Civil War and also oversaw the investigation into the commandant of the Andersonville prison, Henry Wirtz. This and some other political moves over his years led to Rutherford B. Hayes appointing Wallace as territorial governor of New Mexico in 1878. Also, fun fact, U.S. territories didn't elect their own governor till 1948. New Mexico didn't become a state till 1912. Wallace played a role in the Lincoln County War, including issuing arrest orders for those involved in 1879. He also possibly met with Billy the Kid, aka Henry McCarty, aka William Bonney, aka Emilio Sheen. Supposedly, Billy the Kid was offered amnesty by Wallace in exchange for testifying against other people involved in the conflict. However, the prosecutor backed out of this deal, and there are a lot of theories as to what actually happened. So far, this might not seem that strange, but the part of the story that is strange is what Lew Wallace was doing in his spare time at the governor's palace during all this. He was writing the book Ben-Hur. That's right, the best-selling American novel of the 19th century. In fact, it was the best-selling book written by an American till Gone with the Wind overtook it in 1936. Here's a quick synopsis if you haven't read it or seen one of the 5 movie adaptations. A Jewish prince named Judah Ben-Hur, living in the Holy Land at the same time as Jesus, is wrongly imprisoned and enslaved. Him and Jesus repeatedly interact over a big story of Judah Hur's revenge, chariot racing, and eventually redemption by becoming a Christian. There is something really ironic about writing one of the most famous redemption stories in history, while possibly screwing over Billy the Kid trying trying to testify for immunity. Also, interestingly, Lew Wallace was not a particularly religious man by his own admissions. He said he believed in the Christian God, but he did not regularly attend church because, quote, freedom is enjoyable. Overall, an interesting man. Our next topic is about another interesting man, but his story has a much darker ending than Ben-Hur. Next up, we're going to talk about Tom Ketchum. No relation. Tom Ketchum was born in 1863 in San Saba County in central Texas. Tom and his brother Sam bounced around western Texas committing crimes till sometime around 1890. They moved to New Mexico to work as cowboys, but soon started engaging in a bit of casual train robbery. They robbed their first train in 1892. The train was heading towards Deming, New Mexico. Tom and a gang of men accosted that train near Nutt, New Mexico, and took its load. This was just the start of his criminal career. In the following years, he was linked to crimes ranging from robbery to murder. After building up his resume, he joined the Hole in the Wall gang. This was a gang that operated over much of the West and even included famous members like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They were named the Hole in the Wall gang because they would hide out in the Hole in the Wall Pass in Wyoming. It was a very successful hideout with no one actually being captured by the law while in the Hole in the Wall. Other gangs would also use the hideout, and this mixing of gangs led to Tom Ketchum being mistaken for a man known as Black Jack Christian. Tom apparently liked that because he became known as Black Jack Ketchum. This was the beginning of the end for Black Jack though. In northeastern New Mexico, there are two towns named Folsom and Des Moines that are about 8 miles apart. The gang decided to stage a train robbery on that railroad that runs between the two towns. By the way, the footage on screen is the actual area, courtesy of Ratman Bob on the scene. The gang successfully robbed a train on this 8-mile long stretch of track on September 3rd, 1897. It was apparently a good haul and no one got caught. The issue started though when they robbed a train on the same 8-mile long stretch of track less than 2 years later. The gang staged a robbery there without Blackjack on July 11th, 1899. After a series of run-ins with authorities due to this, Sam Ketchum was shot and eventually captured. He would die soon after of his wounds at the Santa Fe Territorial Prison. Then, a little over a month later, on August 16th, 1899, our boy Blackjack tried to rob a train by himself, and guess where it was? It was on the same 8-mile long stretch of track. Supposedly he did not know about the heist with his brother, or even that his brother had died. So Blackjack rode up to the train on his horse, and the conductor recognized him at this point. So the conductor pulled out a shotgun and started blasting. Blackjack was hit from the side, knocking him off his horse, and the train kept chugging along, leaving Blackjack there, but the authorities came to collect him the next day. He was taken to Mount San Rafael Hospital in Trinidad, Colorado, where his arm was amputated. Side note, I cannot imagine going over the Raton Pass, which you have to go from where he was shot to Trinidad, with a gaping injury on a horse. I would prefer they just shoot me again. Once he had healed enough, he was taken to Clayton, New Mexico to stand trial. He was convicted of felonious assault upon a railway train and sentenced to death. Blackjack was the only person ever executed for this charge, as it was later found to be unconstitutional to execute someone for train robbery. He did probably kill people before all this, but they didn't convict him on any of those. He is also the only person to ever be executed in Clayton, New Mexico, and things got a little sloppy. Blackjack gave his last words on the gallows saying, "Goodbye, please dig my grave very deep." Alright, hurry up. He then dropped through the trap door, and a fraction of a second later, his head popped off. In the 1.5 years he was in jail, Blackjack had gained a lot of weight. There was a table to figure out how long a rope should be to snap someone's neck in a hanging, and they reportedly used his weight from when he was captured. There is also speculation that his missing arm may have affected the outcome by changing the center of balance. There are multiple pictures of this incident, including one I'm not showing. I want to be monetized. It clearly shows his head next to him on the ground and his open neck stump. That one was turned into a postcard and sold to commemorate the event. Execution souvenirs are actually a weirdly common thing throughout history, by the way. In Europe, executioners used to make extra money by selling the blood of the executed. Also, souvenirs and even programs like the ones you get at a play were often sold at public executions. As much as people decry violence in movies and video games, our ancestors weren't any better. No matter where or when you go, humans are always doing something messed up. Blackjack was buried in Clayton Cemetery, and he has a lovely grave. Now, I'm going to give you some backstory on an American icon. Smokey Bear, has been the U.S. Forest Service's fire prevention mascot since August 9th, 1944, which is his canonical birthday. 6 years later in 1950, there was a forest fire near Capitan, New Mexico. Firefighters found a young black bear who had climbed a tree to escape the fire. He had lived but was burned on his paws and legs. He was named Smokey after the recently created mascot. The little bear was taken in by a New Mexico game and fish ranger named Ray Bell. Ray and his family worked with a local vet to get Smokey healthy. While Smokey was healing, the national media caught wind of his story and he became a star. Once Smokey was healthy, he was flown to Washington, D.C. to live in the National Zoo. Smokey was not releasable due to living with humans for most of his life at this point. He had a lovely life in D.C. He even had a lovely wife named Goldie Bear who lived with him starting in 1962. The hope was that they would have a cub or two and carry on the Smokey Bear mantle, but that did not happen. The Forest Service still wanted an heir, so they found an orphaned cub from the Lincoln Forest in New Mexico and put it with Smokey and Goldie. The official story was that they adopted the cub. The cub was called Little Smokey, and in 1975 he was anointed Smokey II, Electric Boogaloo. This coincided with our original Smokey, quote, retiring. I can't find a disclosed reason why he retired, but I assume it was health. He died next year on November 9th, 1976. Smokey was flown back to Capitan, New Mexico to be buried. Today you can go see Smokey Bear's grave at Smokey Bear Historical Park, which also includes a pretty cool museum about him and forest conservation. I put a link about it and some other things mentioned in this video in the description. Also, this story is really cute, but don't get it twisted. If this little shit brings trash in my yard again this summer, he's gonna get his ass beat. On to our last topic! In 1870, a man was traveling between Mora, New Mexico and Taos, New Mexico. He decided to stop for the night at the house of a local rancher near Palo Flechado Pass named Charles Kennedy. Kennedy ran a kind of inn out of his house as a side business and was well known to travelers in the area. The man settled in and sat at the table to have dinner with Charles and his family. Making conversation, the traveler asked if they had many issues with the Apache in the area. Charles's son replied with, "Yeah, can't you smell the one in the basement?" The traveler was taken aback by this statement and didn't notice Charles grabbing his gun. Charles shot the man right there at the dinner table. Charles then grabbed his son, yelling,
That is the last secret of mine you tell, boy.
He then bashed his own son's head against the stone fireplace repeatedly till he was dead. During this, Charles's wife ran out of the house fearing she was next. She ran to the nearby town of Cimarron, New Mexico and into the bar of the St. James Hotel. She told the patrons of the bar what had happened. The men in attendance were rallied together by the gunfighter Clay Allison to go to the cabin and take care of Charles. They got on their horses and went to the Kennedy Ranch. They got there and confronted Charles. He attacked the men, but Clay Allison was able to shoot Charles dead. Clay Allison then cut off Charles's head to bring back to Cimarron. Clay put it on the bar of the St. James Hotel, saying he would shoot anyone that moved it. After a few free drinks, Clay was convinced to put the head on a stake outside. Except only about half of that is true. That is the version of the story I originally heard, and if you look around you can find another dozen versions with different people going to town and different ways of killing Charles. At this point, the story has crossed into being folklore. This is a common occurrence with stories in history, especially ones that are dark and involve rural areas or people that weren't really influential, because there was no one there to fact check it. These stories end up being kept alive from oral tradition and inevitably mutate over time. It can be extremely hard, if not impossible, to find the original story. Except we are in luck with this one. Thanks to an article from the Cuesta del Rios News that is linked below, I have found an article in the Santa Fe, New Mexican archive from October 13th, 1870, reporting on Charles Kennedy. The article reads, Charles Kennedy, well known to parties who have traveled the Mora and Taos roads to Elizabethtown and owner of the ranch at the junction of the above roads, was arrested last month and taken to Elizabethtown for examination on a charge of murder. The trial came off on the third instant when Jose Cortez testified as follow, that he was at Kennedy's house on Christmas of last year and that while he was there, he saw Kennedy shoot an American with a pistol, and gave the following particulars. A stranger came to the house afoot and stopped for the night. He was an American and had large red whiskers. Witness and the stranger had gone to bed, and Witness was asleep when a pistol shot awakened him. There was no light in the room, but Kennedy soon after lit a candle, and Witness saw the stranger lying dead on the bed, with a bullet hole through the head. Witness knew that Kennedy killed the man, because there was no one in the house but Kennedy, his wife, the stranger, and himself. After refusing to help Kennedy bury the man, Witness ran away to Taos, but did not tell anyone there what had happened. The article goes on to talk about the trial and human bones being found underneath Charles's house. It goes on to tell us how Charles actually died. He was pulled out of his prison cell by a group of men and hung because they were worried that he wasn't going to get convicted. So going by this, which is probably the closest we'll ever get to a primary source, there are some things in the common folklore versions of the story that are probably not true. 1. At no point do they mention a son, so that's probably not real. In most of the stories, a woman comes to town to tell the authorities to come get Charles, either his wife or another woman, but it seems like it was a man that had stayed there. Also, Clay Allison was probably not involved in this, and if he was, he probably would not have made it known. Not the best idea to brag about breaking someone out of jail and killing them. Also, from what I've read about Clay Allison, it seems really outside of his character to go behead someone. His nickname was the Gentleman Gunfighter, and he was known for playing pranks on people. It seems like a kind of a crazy prank even in the YouTube era to behead someone. This does make it pretty certain though that Charles Kennedy was a real person and actually killed people. With how he operated, there's also a decent chance that he had killed people elsewhere under a different name. This was a somewhat common occurrence throughout the world. There was the Bender family in Kansas who let travelers stay in their house and then kill them and take their possessions. More famously, there's H.H. Holmes who would kill and rob people in his hotel in Chicago. H.H. Holmes is also believed to have committed crimes under different names in different places. And there are even more instances of similar things throughout history, like the Red Inn murders in France. I've also wondered before if Hansel and Gretel was inspired by something like this happening. You know, to kind of act as a warning about staying in strange houses away from other people. In the age before modern policing, if you killed someone and no one saw and no one found the body, I doubt you would ever be caught. Even today, only about 50% of murders are solved in the US and around 70% in other developed countries, and that doesn't even count the murders that were never reported, like when they don't find the body. So the moral to this one is history can be tricky, and you can always find more if you keep digging. That's all I have for you. Like and subscribe, have a great day, and eat something good. America's done some strange things to other countries over the years. I can't go over all of them in one video. I have, however, prepared 5 digestible topics for you today and garnished them with a mild amount of humor. And this intro should now be long enough that I will not get demonetized for the joke I make during the first topic. So let's get cooking. You can't have a video on strange US foreign policy without the chicken tax. Just like you can't be a successful YouTuber in Tampa, Florida without a guy that looks like this as your right-hand man. In 1964, the US was making a lot of chicken. A lot of that chicken was going to France and West Germany at prices much lower than their homegrown chicken. In their opinion, too much chicken. So to protect their local poultry industry, they placed tariffs on chicken imported from the US. In retaliation to this, Lyndon B. Johnson and his penis worked to impose a 25% tariff on foreign-made potato starch, dextrin, brandy, and light trucks to get back at them. How did light trucks end up in there, you wonder? Well, apparently there were some backroom dealings between LBJ and the United Auto Workers involving their election endorsement of him. The Volkswagen Type 2, also known as the VW bus, had been getting a little too popular. Over time, the other goods in the original tariff have returned to normal except the light truck part. In fact, it has even been made more strict over time to now include 2-door SUVs as of 1989. This has led to some creative attempts at loopholes, including putting seats in the back of the Subaru Brat so it would be called a passenger car. Due to this tariff, Toyota, Nissan, and Honda created plans to make their trucks in the US. A new car maker called Ineos, who makes off-road vehicles that definitely are not based on old Land Rover Defenders, has run into the chicken tax recently. You see, their SUV starts at about $73,000, while their upcoming pickup will reportedly cost $86,000 due to them being built in France. The ones who do the most to get around this rule are actually the American manufacturers. A significant amount of GM trucks are made in Canada and Mexico, and Ram has a large plant in Mexico. Ford trucks are assembled in the US, but a lot of the parts are made in Mexico. This is because NAFTA and the United States-Mexico trade agreement have provided a loophole that they can use. Although Ford got a little too cheeky trying to get around this tariff in recent years. See, the Ford Transit Connect, which are the little vans you see florists and bakers often use, were not made in North America. They were made in Turkey. Passenger vehicles only have a 2.5% tax instead of the 25% tax. So all the vans coming out of Turkey would be set up as passenger vans with rear seats and windows, so they were passenger vehicles. Then once they got to Baltimore, most of them would have the seats taken out and the windows replaced with metal panels. Eventually, Customs and Border Protection ruled that all vans would require a 25% tax going forward. Ford sued, and eventually in 2020, the Supreme Court sided with Customs. The 2023 model year was the last year for the Transit Connect, even though it was still selling at a decent rate considering the supply issues the world was going through. It outsold the Lincoln Navigator, the Mazda Miata, and the Toyota GR86. I linked a sales figure chart in the additional reading section down below. This seems like a bit of a I'll take my toys and go home situation. This one is less deep and world altering than the ones that will follow it, although it would make my life better if I could get a Toyota Hilux Champ or a Suzuki Jimny. But let's get into how the US changed the structure of the country that makes those vehicles. As part of Japan's surrender at the end of World War II, their government had to be restructured under the supervision of the Allied powers. This was laid out by the Potsdam Declaration in 1945, which states, "The Japanese government shall remove all obstacles to the revival and strengthening of democratic tendencies among the Japanese people. Freedom of speech, of religion, and of thought, as well as the respect for the fundamental human rights, shall be established." It also says, until that happens, Japan will be occupied by Allied forces. The man who was put in charge of this was U.S. General Douglas MacArthur. Goal number 1 for Japan to complete was that they needed to amend their current constitution. Many different drafts were put forward by different groups both in the government and by civilians. This on top of political delays in the process due to reluctance from Emperor Hirohito and others in the Japanese government, as well as the former Prime Minister Konoe trying to insert himself, led to this process taking longer than it was supposed to. Due to this, in 1946, MacArthur and his command announced that they would be writing the Constitution. They used a proposal by a Japanese group called the Constitution Study Group as inspiration, but it was still mostly written by Americans. The bulk of the writing was done by Lieutenant Colonel Milo Rowell and Major Courtney Whitney, who both had law degrees. They created a draft with others in MacArthur's office, which was then adjusted by Japanese scholars and later the Prime Minister's cabinet. It came into effect on May 3rd, 1947. It included limiting the emperor's power and giving it to a parliament called the National Diet, similar to the United Kingdom's government structure. It also included anti-discrimination rules, right to property, due process, workers' rights, freedom of speech, right to a fair trial, and the abolishment of the nobility, as well as other common civil rights. It also included limiting their military abilities. Article 9 states the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. It also says they will not maintain military forces, although they do have the Japanese Self-Defense Forces. The JSDF, however, is a far cry from their pre-war military power, which included arguably the most powerful navy in the world. Japan's current constitution has not been amended at all since this went into effect. To this day, it is still sometimes referred to as the MacArthur Constitution. With the rising tensions in Eastern Asia, I would not be surprised if the First Amendment to it is restoring military capabilities, likely with the American government's blessing. It is strange to consider that the fourth largest economy in the world operates on a document whose creation was so tightly controlled by a foreigner, especially one that smokes such a goofy-ass pipe. Now let's hop over to the country that gave us CL. The United States and South Korea have had a strange tangled relationship in the years following the Korean War. Today we are focusing on the Republic of Korea United States Combined Forces Command. This was an arrangement that was set up in 1978 in case North Korea attacked South Korea. If that happens, all South Korean and US forces will report to the Combined Forces Command, which is headed by a US general at all times. But they do have a South Korean general as a deputy. Side note, on the Wikipedia page for the Combined Forces Command, they have pictures for the US commanders and South Korean deputies. Most of them look like normal military pictures. There's even this guy whose picture makes him look like a fun time. Then you have poor General Lee and General Han here, who I don't even think they knew their picture was being taken. It's fucked up. So if someday South Korea faces their darkest hour, they instantly fall under the command of the American military. Although the South Korean military does operate on its own accord the rest of the time. It does make sense to some extent to eliminate panic in a time of confusion, but it is still an odd arrangement. Imagine that the autonomy of your nation is under threat from invasion, and the instant response to this is to hand over control of your military. When you combine this level of control with the US military's many failures at holding its personnel responsible for crimes off base as well as against fellow service members, I understand the resentment many people in South Korea hold against the US military. At least the US government is finally starting to address the issues with crime in the military. Until recently, if military personnel committed a crime, it was largely up to their commanding officer if they were charged. Now it is up to an independent military prosecutor. South Korea has definitely become one of the countries most embedded in the American military-industrial complex. But next we'll see what happens when the military-industrial complex gets complex. This one is more current events. In 2016, Australia signed a deal with France to buy 31 billion euros worth of diesel-electric submarines. Over the next couple years, this deal turned into a 56 billion euro deal for 12 submarines. On August 30th, 2021, French and Australian officials released a joint statement saying they were still dedicated to this deal. A few weeks later, Australia announced, "Submarine ship ended with France. Now US-UK, my submarine dealer." Australia announced that they were entering a new defense partnership with the US and UK, which included a new deal for nuclear submarines for Australia. This happened despite the fact that Australia had already put about 1.5 billion euros into the French project. They also ended up paying another 555 million euros to cancel the contract. This also enraged French President Macron, who recalled his ambassadors from the US and Australia for like a week. I'm also not sure why he didn't recall the UK ambassador, especially considering the UK foreign secretary supposedly did a lot of the negotiating. Aside from pissing off the French, this deal is strange for another reason. Only 6 countries have nuclear submarines. They are the US, the UK, India, France, Russia, and China. These are all countries that have extensive nuclear capabilities. Australia would become the first country to buy into having nuclear submarines, at least as far as we know. This new pact, also known as AUKUS, has other parts to it as well. It also has the 3 countries agreeing to work together on defense tech like hypersonic missiles, better radar, and cybersecurity. Other countries are also being considered to join this deal, including Japan being a favorite, according to US Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel? So why is this happening? Well, dick measuring mostly. China and the US have both been expanding their capabilities in the Pacific through defense pacts and new bases. This is part of a lot of posturing both countries are doing right now. China wants to be seen as a true superpower, and the US wants to be seen as the only superpower. If you watch the news, both countries are constantly saying new things about each other. This is the diplomatic equivalent of 2 bros bumping their chests together repeatedly, threatening to fight each other even though they never will. They're huge trading partners as well as nuclear powers. If there was ever a war, it could be the end of both countries and everyone knows it. They're spending tons of money and goodwill because they want to win over smaller countries to have more allies than the other one. This is just a cloud off and France got left out. So let's float on to our last topic. In 1989, a US Navy ship called the USS Maine blew up and sank in the Havana harbor. This kicked off the Spanish-American War, which lasted 7 months and led to the death of over 600,000 soldiers across both sides. The US claimed that the ship had hit a mine left by the Spanish and considered it an act of aggression. This was not an official cause for war, but the coverage of the sinking in the press led to the public sentiment swaying towards war with Spain. The thing is, there's a pretty good chance there was no mine. There have been numerous investigations over the years from the time it happened up till today. The results of these investigations have been split. The Sampson's Board of Inquiry, which was the first official investigation by the US, concluded it was a mine. There have been a lot of criticisms of this board, ranging from its selection to the actual proceeding. Multiple people within the Navy and even at the hearings put forward that it was very possible that the ship blew up due to a coal fire on the ship igniting its ammunition. The Navy had been having more issues with these fires at the time due to changing from anthracite coal to bituminous coal. Bituminous coal has a higher chance of releasing flammable gases in storage. This can lead to fires and explosions, especially in confined spaces like a ship. In fact, shortly after the explosion, a naval captain named Philip Alger said a coal fire being the cause was very likely. Theodore Roosevelt, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, wrote a letter basically saying, "Shut your whore mouth, Alger." In the years since, it seems like the conclusions of the investigations are 50-50 as to whether it was a mine or just a fire. Despite how up in the air the cause of the sinking is, it was good enough for William Randolph Hearst. He had papers to sell, warmongering was a great way to sell them. The US government was happy to go along with it as a way to get a European power away from their territory and to gain control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Well, that's all I have for you. Have a great day and eat something good. The way we generally use the term cult was not common before the 20th century. All of the groups in this video came before 1900, but I am still using the term because they were all religious groups not accepted by the society they were in. This lack of acceptance led to their destruction. As a disclaimer, I've never been a religious man, but I have no issue with anyone who is. Religions are just a special interest of mine. So let's get going. The first couple hundred years of Christianity were pretty chaotic. Many authorities, including the Romans, did not look kindly upon Christians. They were seen as fanatics, following an offshoot of Judaism. In the early 300s, Christianity really began to become accepted, especially after the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to the religion. There was an issue at this time, though. There had not been a real central authority in Christianity up to that point. Different groups of Christians had very different interpretations of the religion. At the time, they didn't even all use the same gospels in the religious texts. Some left gospels out that are in the modern Bible, and some had gospels that are no longer widely used. These extra gospels are often referred to as the biblical apocrypha. There are a lot of them. 14 of the Apocrypha are still sometimes used in printings of the King James Bible and other Bible versions. Depending on how you classify them, there are over 50 apocryphal books. Archaeologists even find new ones in ruins or very old libraries from time to time, like the Gospel of Judas, which was found in the 1970s. We aren't going too deep into that today. It's a huge rabbit hole that people spend their whole careers on. But it's important background information for this story that you know that these and other major differences existed at the time. They were still trying to agree on what book should be in the Bible, let alone what all the tenets of Christianity should be. These divisions went much deeper. Bishops at this time often disagreed on the very nature of Jesus and God. These disagreements were getting so severe that they got back to Emperor Constantine. So, in 325, Constantine called for the First Council of Nicaea. This was a meeting of somewhere around 318 bishops to agree to some standards. The goals of this meeting included everything from banning the clergy from castrating themselves to working towards setting a date for Easter. At the time, the date for Easter was based on when the Jewish community decided to have Passover. This council and several following councils created the basis for the canon that the Catholic Church, the Orthodox churches, and most of the Protestant churches that broke off from them would use. This included things like how to train clergy and which books should be in the Bible. One of the other things these councils established is the Trinity. That is that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are three equally divine entities. There were several other ways of looking at God and Jesus that were common at this time. It's hard to know how many schools of thought there were on this. A lot of this information was suppressed, and there could have been more that we do not know about. These schools of thought are often referred to as heresies. Some of them are just a little different from the Trinity. For instance, Sabellianism said that Jesus was God himself taking on a form to talk to the people of Earth. There was also Monophysitism and Adoptionism that in different ways said that Jesus was conceived as a human and then made godly. The one that was considered to be the worst heresy was known as Arianism. And I already know what you're wondering about. The Arianism in this is spelled with an I, not a Y. It has nothing to do with the other stuff. Arianism was called that because their leader was named Arius of Alexandria. His followers probably didn't call themselves that though. Among other things, Arius taught his followers that God created Jesus, and then through Jesus God made the Holy Spirit instead of them all being eternal. Meaning that they thought that God was the only true God, and Jesus served him and the Holy Spirit served both of them. Arius had quite the following. He and his supporters would go around and argue with the other bishops in Alexandria. These arguments got big enough that Constantine heard about them, and it became a major reason for him calling for the First Council of Nicaea. Arius was invited as one of the attendees of the council. There he argued for his beliefs. And he mostly just made people mad. Supposedly, he was even slapped by St. Nicholas. Side note, there are a bunch of different versions of St. Nicholas's story, and they are all fascinating. They range from him saving girls from prostitution and throwing gold into their window, to resurrecting children killed by a serial killer. Fun! After all was said and done at the council, Arius was exiled to the Roman state of Illyricum, which was the area on the other side of the Adriatic Sea from modern Italy. He later hid out somewhere in Palestine for a few years until Constantine allowed Arius to come back. Then as soon as he got back, Arius was most likely poisoned by an enemy. In the years following this, Arianism actually gained some traction thanks to Constantine's son and a few other leaders sympathizing with them. That came to an end though with the emperors Valens and Theodosius I. Valens began by exiling bishops who did not follow the Creed of Nicaea. Then, after Valens died in battle, Theodosius took over, becoming the last emperor to control the whole Roman Empire. One of his first acts was effectively banning the Arians through decrees and through the First Council of Constantinople in 381. The Aryans in the empire either had to convert, go into exile, or die. The tradition was carried on for a while by Germanic tribes like the Visigoths and the Vandals, who cared very little about Roman authorities. The Visigoths went on to convert to the Nicene Creed in 589, and the Lombards were the last tribe to convert in the late 600s. Arianism got a little interest during the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s and into the Enlightenment in the 17 and 1800s, but mostly from nerds. A theologian named Lelio Sozzini and his nephew Fausto wrote their own Arianism-based texts in the 1550s. These writings became a curiosity to other theologians and later people like Isaac Newton and John Locke, but I can't find any real examples of Arianism becoming a real sect or denomination again. This treatment of the Aryans by the Romans really set a tone for how things would go for people trying to diverge from mainstream Christianity in the future. Which brings us to our next topic. In very basic terms, crusades were wars fought on behalf of the Latin Church during the Middle Ages. The Roman Catholic Church actually has 24 churches within it that are considered to be in full communion with each other. Most Catholics are part of the Latin Church, though. Generally, when people think of crusades, they think of the wars followers of the church fought to try and claim the Holy Land. There were, however, many other wars that are considered crusades. There were many waged against pagans, against unpopular rulers, and in general to maintain the authority of the church and its favored rulers. The one we are interested in is the Cathar Crusade. The Cathars were a religious group, mostly in southern France and in northern Italy, from the 1100s to the early 1200s. Also, they didn't call themselves Cathars, they referred to themselves as good Christians, but that could get confusing, so we are sticking with Cathars, which is what other people called them. The Cathars were not a very unified religious group, but they were believed to have followed a form of Gnostic Christianity. Gnosticism is another school of thought that was considered a heresy, like Arianism. Unlike Arianism, though, Gnosticism has maintained more of a following even into the modern day, with there still being active groups like the Mandeans. There are a lot of different versions of Gnosticism, but they all believe some form of what is called Gnostic cosmology. The basis of Gnostic cosmology is that the God in the Old Testament and the God in the New Testament that Jesus represents are not the same being. Under this, the God in the Old Testament is often referred to as the demiurge and seen as a force of evil. They believe that the world and the people were created by the evil God, which tainted everything with sin. Others believe that the two gods were dual rulers and equals. The research I found seemed kind of split on which version of this the Cathars followed, but they were definitely Gnostic. It seems the Cathars also tended to think of the Holy Spirit as the angels that were still in heaven. They also read their scripture in the common language, which was not common at the time. The Cathars also believed in reincarnation. This led to the Cathars being pescatarian since they thought that humans could be reincarnated into animals. Fish didn't count because, like a lot of people in the Middle Ages, they considered fish and a lot of other small creatures who generate spontaneously. This remained a widely accepted fact till people like Louis Pasteur started working on germ theory in the 1800s, by the way. The core of the Cathars' beliefs was that if they completely rejected the material world, they would stop being reincarnated and go to heaven. This led to some beliefs that put them at odds with the others around them. They believed that sex for the purpose of procreation was wrong because it would lead to a soul being trapped on Earth. Also, they believed the body was just a vessel holding a soul, so whether you were a man or a woman didn't matter since that was just an aspect of your disgusting material body. They also didn't have much of a hierarchy. They had normal believers and they had people called bonums, who went through a number of rituals including baptism and pledging to lead an ascetic life. The bonums were not quite the same role as a priest, but more like the examples for everyone to live by and acted as mentors. From what I could find, all the bonums were considered to be roughly on the same level. There were a few bishops at any given time, but they were more like supervisors for areas that were there to help with problems. The Cathars started to gain the attention of the church in 1147 when they sent the first of many papal legates to try and dissuade the Cathars. A papal legate is someone the Pope has authorized to act on the church's behalf. The church tried to get the Cathars to stop their funny business, first by preaching to the Cathars, and later by sending armies. Across multiple popes, the church continued to try and destroy the Cathar movement. The Dominican order was even created in response to the Cathars. Saint Dominic decided after meeting the Cathars in 1203 that you could only convert people as zealous as the Cathars by matching them. He said, "Zeal must be met by zeal, humility by humility, false sanctity by real sanctity, preaching falsehood by preaching truth." Dominic was not enough to convert the Cathars, however. In 1209, the crusade began, with the massacre at Béziers. Béziers is a city in southern France that at the time had a large population of Cathars. Abbot Ahmad Amalric was at the head of an army of crusaders sent to take care of the Cathars. They laid siege to the city of Béziers. Legend says the abbot gave the order, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Béziers had a population in the range of 10 to 14,000. Everyone who stayed was killed. The crusade went from town to town, wiping out the Cathars, eventually with the direct support of Louis VIII of France. The crusade and the later Inquisition continued till 1350, when it was believed that the Cathars were completely gone. It's hard to put an exact number, but as many as 1 million people may have been killed by this campaign. Many weren't even Cathars. They were just nearby, so they were killed as well. Cathars caught by the Inquisition were subject to punishments ranging from having to wear a yellow cross over their garments to show penance, to being sent to the Holy Land to die in another crusade, or direct execution. This was the first crusade against Christians and is often considered to be a genocide. After this, more crusades were waged against other groups of Christians, but few, if any, were as thorough in destroying an entire group of people. Next topic. In 1814, a child was born in Hua County in China, named Hong Hu-Xiu. Hong grew up wanting to work for the Qing dynasty's bureaucracy. In order to get one of those jobs, you had to pass a civil service exam. Hong kept taking the exam and just couldn't pass. On his way to the second exam, he stopped and listened to a Christian missionary speak. He also took some pamphlets. This would lead to the deaths of over 20 million people. In 1837, after failing the test for a third time, he had a nervous breakdown. While he was recovering, Hong said he had a vision. He said that he met a heavenly family that he was part of, complete with father, mother, and siblings. The father told Hong that the people on Earth needed to worship himself instead of demons. He also apparently gave Hong a golden sword and a seal to kill demons that were infesting heaven. He was also told that his new heavenly older brother would help him. The father also told Hong to change his name to Hong Zhuquan. Also, apparently Confucius was being whipped in the background. After this vision, the people around him apparently noticed that he was like a new man. He was more personable and taller. He spent the next 6 years working as a teacher at different schools near his hometown. He tried taking the test one more time and again failed. After this, though, he read the pamphlets that he got from that missionary 6 years earlier. Keeping a pamphlet for that long without reading it seems like the least likely part of the story so far. After reading these pamphlets, he had a revelation. The man that he met in his dream was God, and his older brother in the dream was Jesus Christ himself. That makes him the younger brother of Jesus. After this realization, he started telling people about his new version of Christianity, and telling people how evil he thought Confucianism and Buddhism was. He also had 2 large swords made so he could kill demons. Obviously. He also began converting people to his new version of Christianity, mostly his relatives who were also part of the Hakka ethnic group. The 2 important ones for the story from this time were Feng Yunshan and Hong Rengen. They started to go to small villages and destroy the objects of their faith, and the villagers were understandably angry. This led to Hong and his cousins losing their teaching jobs. Our main characters then wandered around preaching the good word for the next few years. Hong also started to write his own literature and studied under an American Southern Baptist missionary. They had steadily grown their following, and Feng gave it the name God-Worshipping Society.
A few moments later,
Feng was banished and Hong went to find him. While they were gone, 2 of their followers, Yang Xiaoqing and Zhao Chaogui, suddenly gained the ability to also speak to the heavens. But Yang could only talk to God and Zhao could only talk to Jesus. When Feng and Hong got back, they confirmed that this was true. Feng, Yang, Zhao, and 2 later leaders named Wei Changui and Shi Dakai would come also to be known as Brothers of Jesus. They all continued to minister and spread their version of Christianity through their own version of tent revivals learned from the Baptist missionaries. Hong also wrote his own version of the Bible and started to give it to his followers, saying that it was an ancient Chinese version of the Bible that was hidden by the other religions. The actual religion Hong preached was a strange jumble of different Chinese mythologies, folklore, and Christianity that was adjusted to fit Hong's stories. He even had his own take on the nature of Jesus. Hong would say that Jesus was just God's oldest son. All of his miracles were God working through him. He also considered Jesus to be a servant to God and not an equal. Jesus was considered to be above Hong and the other sons in the organization though, since he was the oldest. Around 1850, things really started to take off. Hong had tens of thousands of followers, and this was when the government started to take notice. Authorities came to tell them to break it up, and then later attacked them when they said no. The God-worshipping society defeated the imperial troops that were sent after them, which led to an even bigger force being sent the next year. And once again, the imperial troops were defeated. Hong then notified his followers that they were now part of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. They soon began to expand their kingdom, and eventually settled on Nanjing as their capital after they took it by force. While there, they killed upwards of 40,000 members of the Manchu ethnic group because Hong's dream had said they were evil. They also began to institute a number of policies. These included the banning of foot binding, declaring all people equal regardless of sex and class, the abolishment of private land ownership, switching to a solar calendar, and a number of modernization policies like a patent system and promoting the use of trains and steamships. Also, one of their stranger policies was that men and women were separated to the point that for a few years, married couples were not allowed to live together. Also during this period, Hong started to stay in his inner chambers and give his followers written orders while lounging with the women he kept in those chambers. Yang, who was the guy that could talk to God but not Jesus, began running a lot of the day-to-day. He would also argue with Hong, whose orders had gotten more and more ridiculous. Yang was then killed. Then in 1859, Han Rengen, who was one of the cousins he converted at the start, showed up and was quickly made one of the top leaders in the organization. Rengen had come up with a plan to defeat the imperial forces that had been attacking Nanjing while all this was happening, as well as a way to expand their territory. Taiping's forces went and attacked another city nearby, which caused the army that was besieging Nanjing to leave to back up that city. Taiping's forces then quickly headed towards Nanjing so that all of their forces could encircle the army that had been attacking them. After this, the Taiping forces began conquering provinces on the way to Shanghai. They had also recruited many new members before the march and along the way. They were estimated to have an army that was around 2 million strong. The provinces they conquered were some of the most wealthy and populated in the country at the time. Millions of civilians were killed during this march, both directly and from starvation and disease during the sieges. Although the Qing dynasty did take censuses of their population regularly, the Taiping forces destroyed a lot of infrastructure. This, on top of the damage done by the Opium Wars that had happened just a few years earlier, and the unrest after Taiping and the later Boxer Rebellion, means records are sparse. There was a census from 1851 that showed that the populations of the provinces involved was about 170 million. 60 years later, the population of those areas was 105 million. It's hard to know how much of that decline was from Taiping's attacks, and how much the population rebounded after. There are many different figures for how many casualties came from this. They range from 20 million to 90 million. I am not an expert, so I am not going to try and argue for a particular figure. I will tell you that this was definitely one of the deadliest events in history. It probably had a death toll similar to World War I, but everyone was from the same country. The march was the beginning of the end for Taiping, though. Taiping began their siege of Shanghai in 1862. Forces made up of regular members of the Qing army, Western forces who were in the city largely due to the aftermath of the Opium Wars, and quickly trained recruits from local villages defended Shanghai successfully. After this, the Imperial Army began to reclaim territory and push the Taiping forces back towards Nanjing. In 1862, the Imperial forces began a siege of Nanjing. By 1864, the city was running low on food. It didn't help that Hong had abdicated his position, and his 15-year-old son was now in charge, who, despite being the nephew of Jesus, was not an effective leader. One day, Hong went out and tried to forage for plants to eat. Shortly after, he fell sick and died 20 days later. It is unknown if he picked poisonous plants on purpose as a way of committing suicide, or if he just sucked at making weed salad. Shortly after he died, Nanjing also fell. The followers in Nanjing almost all fought and died instead of surrendering. As many as 100,000 followers died after the Imperial forces breached the walls. Hong's body was dug up to verify that he actually died. He was then dismembered, cremated, and then put in a cannon and shot out so that his spirit would never find peace. Afterwards, some parts of Taiping continued to resist and were pursued by the Imperial Army. By 1866, the last remnants of Taiping had either been captured or killed, and the god-worshipping society was effectively gone. Following these events, the Qing dynasty took its revenge on the Hakka people. Millions were killed, sometimes as many as 30,000 in a day. This whole affair is viewed differently by different groups of people from what I found. It is often referred to as the Taiping Rebellion, but it's also called the Taiping Revolution and the Taiping Civil War. It can be viewed as a cult leader trying to seize power. It can be seen as one of many uprisings in the era against the Qing dynasty. Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party saw it as a predecessor to their communist revolution. It seems like it almost acts like a Rorschach test that appears differently depending on your worldview. What is definitely true is that it is one of the most important events in Chinese history, and probably played a role in the tumultuous decades that followed. That's all I have for you. I hope you have a great day and eat something good. I think often when history is taught, it is too sanitized. This makes it hard to see historical figures as actual humans. Today I want to give you a different look at the US presidents, the strange side, the human side, what they were up to, what they were into. It'll be in 4 convenient categories with the stuff that you already know left out. So get a snack and let's get going. Let us start with the humanness of their bodies, since it influences some things covered later. A number of presidents have had health issues beyond being old men. Some of these are more well known. John F. Kennedy was all messed up. Even as a kid, he had scarlet fever and irritable bowel syndrome. While he was still young, he had osteoporosis and several back surgeries. One of these went so poorly, he was given last rites because he almost died due to a bone infection. He had to wear a back brace for much of his political career, and it has been theorized that this brace kept him upright after the first bullet hit him, which made it easier for the second shot to hit his head. It is also believed that he had Addison's disease. Addison's makes it so your adrenal glands do not produce enough of 2 hormones. One being cortisol, which is often associated with stress, but it also plays roles in regulating blood pressure, the immune system, blood sugar, and heart function. The other is aldosterone, which balances sodium and potassium in the body. If any of these functions go wrong, you can die. JFK did have medication to treat this at the time, but it was a pretty new field and there was probably a lot of side effects he was dealing with. It's hard to know for sure how it was going because JFK never admitted to having Addison's and in general downplayed his health issues when asked. There is speculation that he may have had another disease similar to Addison's, but we're not for sure. What we are for sure on is he was a very sick man throughout his life, and despite this, he managed to become one of the most important presidents in the history of the United States. Another man that is considered to be one of the greatest presidents was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was also failed by his body. When he was 39, he was paralyzed from the waist down due to an illness. At the time, he was diagnosed with polio, but in the years since, doctors have suggested that he may have had Guillain-Barré syndrome or other nerve-affecting illnesses. It was never a complete secret that he was paralyzed, but the press did agree to not publicize the fact by not photographing him in his wheelchair. Towards the end of World War II, FDR's health began to deteriorate. After going to the Tehran Conference in 1943, he began to have issues with shaking as well as losing weight and low energy. He was diagnosed with high blood pressure and congestive heart failure. His doctor gave him heart medication and told him to limit himself to 6 cigarettes a day. In 1945, for the first time, he addressed Congress from his wheelchair. Before this, he would use leg braces to stand. The next month, he went to his frequent retreat, Warm Springs, Georgia, where he would soak in the waters to rest. While there, he was sitting for painting and complained of a headache. His blood pressure had shot up to 300/190. That day, he died of a brain hemorrhage. This made him the 4th president to officially die of natural causes in office. The 3rd to die of natural causes in office was Warren Harding, who died in 1923 of heart failure. This one is a bit contentious though. His wife Florence Harding was viewed suspiciously at the time for refusing to do an autopsy and immediately burning most of his papers. Before him was Zachary Taylor in 1850, who died after eating a lot at a party. There were theories for a long time that he had been poisoned for his stance against slavery, but that was cleared up in 1991. His body was exhumed and analyzed by Oak Ridge National Lab, which found no evidence of poison in his bones. It is believed that he died of plain old gastroenteritis, probably from the sewage that was in the White House's water supply. At the time, Washington, D.C.'s water system was pretty shitty. And before him, there was William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison's inauguration was a cold and rainy day. Despite this, he gave a 2-hour-long speech. He also then went for a walk without a coat or hat later in the month and got caught in the rain again. This made him more sewage susceptible. The diagnosis his doctors gave him at the time was pneumonia, but now it is thought that he likely died of typhoid fever and the treatments his doctors gave him. This was the early 1800s, so he was treated with bloodletting, opium, and brandy. Remember everyone, if you're gonna drink poop water, buy a raincoat. A number of presidents are speculated to have had mental issues based on researchers looking through their writings and accounts of people who interacted with them. It's hard to diagnose anyone with a mental disorder without a doctor directly working with them, so take the following theories with a grain of salt. Probably the most concrete instance is that Woodrow Wilson is known to have had multiple strokes during his life, including while he was in office. This includes one in 1919 that left him largely incapacitated for the final years of his presidency. It is believed that his wife Edith was handling a lot of the duties at this time, though there is debate as to how much. A number of other presidents are believed to have dealt with some form of depressive disorder. Most famously, Abraham Lincoln is known to have suffered from bouts of severe depression throughout his life. At the time, his doctors considered him to have melancholy. He was also considered suicidal several times throughout his life, where those around him had to basically put him on suicide watch, where they would take his knives and sit with him to make sure he didn't kill himself. Supposedly during the Civil War, he would avoid using knives because he was worried that an urge would overcome him, but I'm not sure how valid that statement is or if that's a legend. Theodore Roosevelt, on the other hand, is often thought to have had some form of bipolar disorder based on his behavior. Teddy was described as manic even in his time. He was known for spending money like it was nothing, almost obsessively working to the point that he supposedly wrote 150,000 letters in his life, and his inability to sit still. A diplomat from the time was quoted as saying, "You must always remember that the president is about 6. Theodore had a habit of running in places where it wasn't quite proper. Another popular theory is that, like me and probably a fair percentage of my audience, Thomas Jefferson may have had high-functioning autism. He was often criticized for not making eye contact and dressing too comfortably for occasions, like wearing slippers to cabinet meetings. He also kept a very specific routine. He would take his pet mockingbirds to meetings with him, and he had a myriad of other personality traits that are congruent with being autistic. People also throw mental illnesses at Nixon, like throwing pasta at the wall to see what sticks to try and explain his odd behavior. I think a lot of it was alcohol, and we'll get to that later. The recent discussions on Biden's mental declines are also not unprecedented for a president. There are many stories that lend credence to the idea that Ronald Reagan started showing symptoms of Alzheimer's while he was still president. I can't put in the video for copyright reasons, but there is a clip in the additional reading section in the description of Reagan being fed lines by Nancy during an interview by the press. There's a lot of back and forth you can find online about this one, partially due to Reagan's influence on his party. It's a topic I would encourage you to look into more if it interests you. There have been many books, articles, and studies written on this subject. Lastly, due to the power and fame it entails, you could argue that world leaders in general are prone to narcissism. Some more than others. Now on to some sex. Let's get into the juicy stuff. Do you know we had a president with an open marriage? That's not the one I'm talking about, but possible. I'm referring to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, who were also 5th cousins once removed. Eleanor was Teddy's niece. They are both believed to have had a number of lovers during their marriage. FDR's first affair that Eleanor found out about was with Eleanor's secretary, Lucy Mercer, in 1918. It seems from letters we have from them after this point, it was largely a marriage of convenience. They did seem to care for each other to some extent though, as she did help a lot with his recovery from the sickness that paralyzed him. Also, Lucy Mercer went on to marry another man, but she was still with FDR when he died at Warm Springs a year after the death of her husband. Eleanor was not there. There are 4 other women I have seen consistently listed as possible mistresses for FDR. First, Daisy Suckley, who was also with him when he died. She also took a lot of the pictures we have of FDR in his personal life and in his wheelchair. We don't have a lot of insight into their relationship as a lot of their letters were burned. One of the letters we do have has FDR saying, "I have longed to have you with me." So take that as you will. He was also linked to Princess Martha of Sweden, who stayed at the White House for much of the war. She was also known to often sail on FDR's yacht with him. FDR's son was quoted as saying, "There was no question that Martha was an important figure in Father's life during the war. There is a real possibility that a true romantic relationship developed between the president and the princess." There is also his secretary of 20 years, Missy LeHand, who was very close to him, and it is debated if they had a romantic relationship. Missy was his closest advisor in the White House and chief of staff in all but name. She was in basically all meetings, she vetted his mail, and decided whether or not something was important enough to wake him up for during the night. She also spent evenings with him in his study and often sailed with him. FDR's son Elliot also said it was normal for her to sit on FDR's lap. Also, Eleanor's biographer described the way she treated Missy as, quote, "in the manner of the Asian matriarchs, as the junior wife." Missy also received half of the income of FDR's estate in his will. All that said, there is one thing that is often brought up regarding whether or not FDR had actual sexual affairs in the White House. We aren't entirely sure if his penis continued to work when his legs didn't. While all this was happening, Eleanor had her own fun. Eleanor had her own house on the large Roosevelt family estate in Hyde Park, New York. She built it with 2 women she called life partners named Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman. Both were prominent political activists at the time. They spent much of their time living together in the house, and there's very cute pictures of them. We also have 18 boxes of seemingly romantic letters between Eleanor Roosevelt and a journalist named Lorena Hickok. In one of these letters, Eleanor said, quote, "I want to put my arms around you and kiss you at the corner of your mouth." Eleanor also made it clear to multiple people that she never enjoyed sex with FDR and that she had no interest in raising their children. The children were mostly raised by FDR's mother, Sarah. FDR actually never lived separately from his mother until she died in 1941. She was living in the White House with them. At Hyde Park, they even had houses next to each other with a tunnel that joined them. Now we're going to be less FDR heavy going forward. Something else that was open in White House was Lyndon Johnson's fly. He would often pull out his penis he nicknamed Jumbo while talking to people. I don't know if he actually saw this as a sexual act or if it just stemmed from the strange part of his personality, where he seemed to value catching people off guard over a lot of other things. He was also known for having meetings in the bathroom and taking people for rides in his amphicar without telling them it could go in the water. He would then pretend that the brakes had failed and they were going to die by crashing into the Potomac. Okay, let's get to the next president my history nerds are most expecting for the sex section out of the way. James Buchanan was the president before Lincoln and is widely blamed for starting the Civil War. We aren't focusing on that part, but I put an article below if you want to know more. We are focusing on James Buchanan's sexuality. He is also known as the Bachelor President because he is the only president to never marry. There are 3 theories as to why he never married. The first one is, at one point he was engaged to a woman named Anne Coleman. They had an argument and she broke off the engagement because she thought he was only interested in her because she was from a wealthy family. Shortly after, she overdosed on laudanum, which is a mixture of opium and alcohol that was common at the time. It's unknown if it was an accident or on purpose. Her family would not allow him to attend the funeral. Some people think he remained a bachelor because he could not get past this loss. The second theory is that he was gay. He lived with a man named William Rufus King for many years, and they often attended social functions together. 2 men living together and attending functions together was pretty normal at the time. This was partially due to how separated men and women were in society back then. What wasn't as common at the time was the 2 of them being referred to as Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy. Supposedly Andrew Jackson started this. We're going to be talking about Mr. Jackson a lot. They stopped living together in 1844 but had plans of eventually running for president and vice president together. That didn't end up happening though. William King was elected as vice president with Franklin Pierce, but King had to take his oath of office in Cuba in 1853, where he was receiving treatment for tuberculosis. He died a little over a month later. We don't have a strong conclusion on the nature of the relationship because it is believed that a lot of their letters to each other were burnt by their nieces. I'm starting to feel left out that I'll never get to burn someone's letters. The third theory is that James Buchanan may have simply been asexual. Maybe the reason Anne felt like he didn't really love her was because he couldn't be attracted to her, and maybe Buchanan and King were just friends. We do have a letter that Buchanan wrote saying that he might marry if he could find a woman that was okay with his, quote, lack of ardent or romantic affection. I wouldn't rule out any of the 3 options from what I read, although I feel like him being straight is probably the least likely. On the other end of things, we have the man we just mentioned, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had his own strange marriage situation. See, Andrew Jackson fell in love with a woman named Rachel Donaldson while he was boarding at her mother's house. Rachel and Jackson hit it off and began living together. This was upsetting to Rachel's husband. Rachel was still married to a man named Louis Robards. They were separated, but that wasn't really a thing yet. Robards filed for a divorce from Rachel for adultery. Divorce was extremely rare at this point in American history. The divorce between Robards and Rachel was one of just 42 granted by the Virginia state legislature in a 40-year period. This included a lengthy trial where Rachel was convicted of abandoning her husband. After the divorce was actually final, Jackson and Rachel married for real this time. They went on to have a mostly happy marriage. This was an extremely scandalous story though, and it followed them going forward. Jackson often dueled people that spoke ill of Rachel. The scandal also became a big issue while he was running for president. Rachel was dragged through the mud by his opponents throughout the campaign. Rachel died of a heart attack shortly before her husband's inauguration. He always blamed the stress from the controversy surrounding their marriage during the election for her heart attack. Despite all this, Jackson and Buchanan actually share something in common. They never fathered a child. The Jacksons did take in a number of children over the years though. This included Andrew Jackson Jr., whose mother was Rachel's sister. Her sister had twins, so she gave one to Andrew and Rachel, who raised him as their own son. He also adopted a Native American boy who became known as Lincoya Jackson. Lincoya was a member of the Creek tribe, and Jackson found him in the arms of his dead mother, who died on Jackson's orders as a general. Lincoya was basically meant to be a pet for Andrew Jackson Jr. He died as a teenager of tuberculosis. Warren Harding was also thought to have no children, but DNA testing has shown that he had a child with his mistress, Nan Britton. In a similar vein, James Madison did not officially father any children of his own, but had a stepchild through his wife Dolly. There's also evidence that he may have had a child with his half-sister Corinne, who was a slave in his house. Corinne's parents were James Madison's father and one of his slaves. Two more that, as far as we know, didn't have children were James Polk and George Washington, because they were both sterile. Polk became sterile due to a botched urinary stone surgery. Think about that one. On the other hand, George Washington became sterile due to smallpox, which was not an uncommon occurrence at the time. George had stepchildren though from his wife Martha, who was a widow of a wealthy landowner named Daniel Custis. Martha had 4 children, but only one lived to adulthood. John Park Custis. John officially had 7 children before he died at the age of 26 in 1781. 4 of his children lived to adulthood, and George and Martha played a very active role in their lives. A black abolitionist named William Costin is also believed to have been the son of John Park Custis and one of his slaves, Anne Costin. Anne is believed to have been the daughter of Martha Washington's father, John Dandridge. When he died, John Custis passed down a great deal of wealth to his acknowledged descendants due to his biological father's estate. This eventually passed to the great-granddaughter of Martha and George Washington, Mary Anna Custis Lee, and her husband, Robert E. Lee. They inherited a large piece of land near Arlington, Virginia that they would call home till the Civil War. To punish Robert E. Lee, the land was confiscated by the US government and turned into what is now known as Arlington National Cemetery. The last topic for this section is about another founding father, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had plenty of kids. He had 6 children with his wife Martha, and possibly 6 more with his slave Sally Hemings. It is known for sure Jefferson and Sally Hemings had children together, but we aren't sure how many. We know for sure 4 lived into adulthood. They were named Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. Sally Hemings was pretty light-skinned, so her kids with Jefferson were able to pass as white in society. The only reason they got this chance to integrate into white society was because Sally managed to negotiate their freedom. While Sally and Jefferson were in Paris, where slavery was not legal, she exchanged her freedom for her children's. Really think about that. She had to negotiate with the father of her children so that they would not be slaves. I can't do justice to the whole story of how Sally Hemings and other enslaved people were treated in America in this video. I will say that is another part of history that is often too sanitized. Slaves were not treated as humans, and as such experienced all the worst things you can imagine happening to a person. I put articles about Sally Hemings as well as a famous case of cruelty against slaves down below if you want to know more. This is a pretty heavy but important topic, but the rest of the video is a bit more silly. We've already talked about how a number of presidents had health issues. Many of these conditions required medication. Due to his health problems, JFK was known to sometimes get multiple lidocaine injections in his back a day. He was also known to take the painkillers codeine, Demerol, and methadone. He also took multiple drugs for anxiety, as well as Ritalin and barbiturates to go up and down. He also took thyroid hormones and corticosteroids to manage his adrenal issues. FDR is also believed to have taken a host of painkillers and other drugs for his illnesses. We aren't sure what though, because his medical records disappeared shortly after his death. Likely burnt. George Washington is believed to have used laudanum to deal with the pain from his famous dental issues. Thomas Jefferson took opium to help with his diarrhea issues. Trainspotting's a great movie if you haven't seen it. Also keep in mind, opium and cocaine were legal and pretty commonly used before the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1914 and the Jones-Miller Act in 1922. They weren't a lot of commonly used medicines, so we wouldn't necessarily have a lot of accounts of presidents using them because it would be like reporting on a modern president taking ibuprofen. There's also a good chance that a lot of presidents born before the 1920s would have probably been given opium-based medicine when they were teething as babies. Possibly the most used drug by presidents has been tobacco. Washington and Jefferson both grew it on their large estates. Ronald Reagan was in cigarette ads when he was an actor, but quit after his brother got cancer. Supposedly, Ulysses S. Grant smoked 20 cigars in one day during the Civil War. He also died of throat cancer. Gerald Ford was a bit of a hipster and smoked 8 pipes a day. It seems that most presidents, at least at some point in their lives, were smoking like a choo-choo. From our founding fathers whose fortunes were partially built upon tobacco, to Obama who had to promise Michelle to quit in order to run for president. Donald Trump claims to have never used tobacco, alcohol, or any other drugs. I reached out for clarification, but did not receive a response at the time of recording. There are only a couple other presidents who claim to have not drank alcohol. The other 3 that I found were Zachary Taylor, Rutherford B. Hayes, and William Taft. The rest range from social drinkers to probable alcoholics. George Washington also owned one of the largest whiskey distilleries in America. One president that definitely drank was Grover Cleveland, who at one point cut back on his drinking to live a healthier life. He cut back to 1 gallon of beer a day. He was from New Jersey. Also, after having done all this reading on presidents for this video, I've come to a conclusion. I think Grover Cleveland would be the best tasting president in a cannibalistic scenario. Fun fact, the cows that become Wagyu beef are fed beer. On the other hand, Nixon was a lightweight and was drunk often. His alcoholism and its effect on his mental state was even a concern among the White House staff. His Secretary of Defense, James Schlesinger, went on record in the years after saying he told the military not to follow orders from the White House unless they were confirmed by him or Henry Kissinger. Kissinger was known to say that if it was up to Nixon, there would have been a nuclear war every week. When Henry Kissinger thinks you're too into bombing, it really says something. You have probably watched or read one of the 5 million things made about the Lincoln and JFK assassinations, so we are not going to spend much time on those. There is an interesting piece of context about the Lincoln assassination, though, that I feel is often left out. Prior to the assassination, John Wilkes Booth was already famous because he was one of the most popular actors in the country. From the reviews I could find from the time, he apparently had a lot of energy and was considered to be extremely handsome. I never really thought about it before, but he is kind of hunky. His brother Edwin Booth was widely considered to be the best actor of his time. Edwin also founded The Players, which is a social club for actors that is still relevant to this day. His father Junius was also a famous actor. His father also wrote letters to Andrew Jackson threatening to slit his throat. It's nice when a father and son share interests. So think about what the average person's reaction to hearing the news about Lincoln would have been. Oh my god, the president has been shot! Oh, I really liked his assassin in Richard III. The other thing you might not know about Lincoln is that Booth was not the first to take a shot at him. A few months earlier, he was riding his horse, and an unknown gunman shot the hat off his head. They never figured out who, though. There was also the Baltimore plot, which was supposedly a plot to kill him on his way to DC after being elected. There is a pretty good chance that it was made up by Alan Pinkerton, though, to promote his company, the Pinkertons. We're going to talk more about them in videos later if you stick around. There was also an assassination attempt on JFK before the one you know about. In 1960, a 73-year-old Florida man filled his car with dynamite with the intent to blow up JFK while he was on vacation. Him and his family had gone to Palm Beach between the election and the inauguration to relax. The Florida man in question was Richard Pavlik, and his main motive was that he did not like Catholics. The Secret Service caught him, though, thanks to his threats around town and someone alerting them that he had bought dynamite. He also backed out of his first attempt because he did not want to blow up Jackie and the kids, which gave authorities time to find him. Pavlik was committed to a mental hospital. 2 other presidents have also been assassinated, and they are not as widely talked about. James Garfield was shot to death at a train station by a man named Charles Guiteau in 1881. Charles was a man that never found a place to belong. He was even kicked out of the Oneida community, which was a sex cult commune that went on to make silverware. He eventually contracted neurosyphilis. This is the end stage of how syphilis kills someone. It infects the brain and central nervous system and causes severe brain damage and behavior changes. Charles basically hallucinated that Garfield owed him the position of ambassador to France and took his revenge. Charles was executed. The other president that got was William McKinley. In 1901, McKinley was assassinated at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York by a man named Leon Zalgas. Leon was an anarchist who wanted to fight wealth inequality. He said that his goal in assassinating McKinley was to change the structure of the government so that the wealthy would no longer take advantage of the poor. Didn't work. Leon was executed, and strangely, the prison officials poured sulfuric acid on him in his coffin to dissolve him. There have been plenty of other assassination attempts as well. Until the 22nd Amendment was ratified in 1947, the 2-term limit was a tradition as opposed to a rule. Teddy Roosevelt, having ascended to the presidency due to McKinley's assassination, had some leeway. After completing McKinley's term, he decided he only had 1 more term left, so he only ran for re-election once afterwards, stepping aside for William Howard Taft to run. After 1 term of Big Boy Taft, Teddy changed his mind and ran as a third-party candidate for the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party. At one of his campaign stops, a man named John Schrank shot Roosevelt in the chest during a speech. Schrank claimed he did this because McKinley told him to in a dream. He spent the rest of his life in a mental hospital. Do you know what Roosevelt did after he was shot? He finished the speech. The bullet had hit him in his breast pocket where he had his 50-page speech and his metal glasses case. Because of this, the bullet went into him just a little bit, and he wasn't coughing up blood, so he continued. His fifth cousin was also shot at during a speech. FDR was also in Florida between his election and his inauguration. While he was giving a speech in Florida, a man named Giuseppe Zangara fired 5 shots towards him. None of them hit FDR, but the mayor of Chicago, Anton Cermak, was killed and 4 in the crowd were injured. There are a lot of questions about this one. Giuseppe was an Italian immigrant, and we don't know a lot about what he was up to before the assassination attempt. We know he served in the Italian army before coming over. We also know that, like many people in the Great Depression, he was mad at the wealthy. We know he had chronic health issues. He said one of his main motives was, quote, "Since my stomach hurt, I want to make even with the capitalist by kill the president. My stomach hurt long time." That was a direct quote, and all the quotes from him I found were in broken English. I read that many people around the incident weren't sure if he had the mental ability to understand what he did, but I'm also not sure if these questions about his mental state are legitimate, or if people assumed that because he spoke broken English and had an unusual worldview. He made it clear that he hated anarchists, communists, socialists, capitalists, and fascists. He might have liked something, but we didn't really have enough time to find out. The shooting occurred February 15th, 1933, and Giuseppe was executed on March 20th, 1933. Giuseppe's other legacy is that the term death row was created because of him. Florida law didn't allow prisoners awaiting execution to share a cell with anyone. There was already someone waiting to be executed, so they had to designate more cells, becoming a death row instead of a death cell. There are also theories that the mayor of Chicago that died was the intended target and that Giuseppe had been hired by members of organized crime. I also can't find much evidence to support this besides the fact that he was Italian. On the other hand, Gerald Ford had 2 attempted assassins who were part of groups and were probably not all there. The more famous of the 2 attempts happened on September 5th, 1975 in Sacramento. A woman named Lynette Fromm, also known as Squeaky, tried to shoot Ford from within arm's reach but forgot to chamber a round. Squeaky was a member of the Manson family cult. She has said that her motive was that Ford had talked about loosening air pollution regulations. This meant that she had to kill Gerald Ford to save the redwoods. She was paroled in 2009. The second attempt on Ford came 17 days later on September 22nd, 1975 in San Francisco. Shooter number 2 was also a woman, and her name was Sarah Jane Moore. Moore became interested in the left-wing movements in San Francisco after the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. She began working as a bookkeeper at People in Need, which was created by William Randolph Hearst to make it look like he cared about poor people to try and prevent future relative kidnappings. She was also fired from there, and from the interviews I found of people who worked there, she was probably fired for being annoying. During this time, she met people involved in leftist organizations, and she would inform on them to the FBI. It is believed that she was also involved in the group known as Tribal Thumb, including living with a member shortly before the assassination attempt. Tribal Thumb is its own rabbit hole, and I have an interesting article about them below. Fun fact, Tribal Thumb may have also been informing on other groups to the FBI. The day before she shot at Ford, she had her .44 Magnum and 113 rounds confiscated by the police. They let her go, and the next day, she bought a new gun to shoot the president with. The thing she didn't know is that the new pistol was sighted incorrectly, so she missed. The first shot went wide, then a retired Marine named Oliver Sipple grabbed her arm and tried to stop her. The second shot ricocheted and hit an innocent taxi driver named John Ludwig. He lived! Sarah has since said she did it to start a revolution, which is a better excuse than John Hinckley, who shot Ronald Reagan to impress Jodie Foster. In 2007, Moore was paroled, and she has done several TV interviews since then. I linked a video where a news station had her react to the first Trump assassination attempt. And finally, we will wrap up the violence section with the most violent president. On January 30th, 1835, a man named Richard Lawrence shot at Andrew Jackson with 2 pistols as he was leaving a funeral at the US Capitol building. Richard did this because he thought that he was Richard III of England and that Jackson was preventing him from accessing his funds. Both pistols misfired and Jackson began mercilessly beating Richard with a cane. Davy Crockett had to step in to keep Jackson from killing Richard. Richard would spend the rest of his life in asylums. Although this was the most important day in Richard's life, for Jackson, it was Tuesday. It is believed that Jackson participated in 103 duels in his life, so having a gun pointed at him was not a new experience. It was a new experience for the country though, because he was the first president to have an assassination attempt. All these weird Andrew Jackson stories are kind of the tip of the iceberg. If you want to know more, there's a great book called American Lion by John Meacham that I recommend. Also, there's a fun song about Andrew Jackson. Well, that's all I have for you. I hope you have a great day and eat something good.
There was once a rich man that lived in the countryside. He had a lot of land and a lot of money, but he had no wife. You see, he had a hard time approaching women because they were weirded out by his blue beard. Women were also reluctant to become involved with him because he had been married multiple times. He approached a local woman to ask about marrying one of her daughters. The daughters were not interested in him due to his blue beard and his bad reputation. He told them he could change their mind. The whole family and their friends should come to his estate for a fun weekend. And a fun weekend they did have. They were impressed by his big house, great food, and beautiful land. The younger daughter decided she could work with the blue.
She and the blue-bearded man were soon married. Not long after, he needed to go away on a business trip. He gave her the keys to the room where he kept his fine food, the room where he kept all his money, and even the one where he kept his jewels and art. He also gave her one more small key. He said that it opened the door to the closet in the hall. He also said that she should not open that one, and if she did, it would be the worst mistake she has ever made. Bluebeard left the next day, and his wife's sister went to the house to keep her company. Her brothers would come by the next day, as they hadn't gotten to see the house yet due to their obligations as members of the country's military. The wife and her sister were having a lot of fun with the whole estate to themselves, but the wife couldn't stop thinking about the closet in the hallway. What could her new husband be hiding in there? After her sister went to bed, the wife took the small key off the ring and went to open the closet. She excitedly opened the door and took a few steps in. It was dark, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust to see what was inside. When they did, she saw the heads of multiple women in varying states of decay on the shelves of the room. In her shock, she dropped the key on the dusty floor. She ran out of the room and closed the door. She ran up to her bed to try and forget what she had seen. That next morning, her husband returned home. They greeted each other, and she tried to just act normal, not knowing what to do about her situation. A little while after, he came to her and asked why the closet key wasn't on the key ring. She said it must have fallen off. He asked, "Then why were your footprints in there?" He grabbed her by the hair and started dragging her to where he kept his sword. She pleaded with him not to kill her. He said he had to now. She said, "Well, at least let me pray first." He told her she had 15 minutes. She ran to her sister and took her to the top of the tallest tower in the estate. She told her that Bluebeard was going to kill her, and asked her sister to flag down a passerby or their brothers for help. Bluebeard began banging on the door, saying that it was time. The wife came out willingly in an attempt to protect her sister. Bluebeard began dragging her to the courtyard, along with his sword. She began pleading with him again, trying to buy any time. When they got to the courtyard, he threw her to the ground and said that this is the end. Then they heard a banging at the gate, and then the sound of 2 horses. It was her brothers. The sister had already yelled to them what was going on. Bluebeard began to run, but her brothers ran him down and cut off his head. Bluebeard had no heirs, so all of his wealth and property went to his new widow. She used her new wealth to find a wealthy husband for her sister and to help her brothers get promoted. She also used it to find a new husband, with hopes of him helping her to forget the last one. There are many different versions of this story. The first written version of Bluebeard came from a wealthy Frenchman named Charles Perrault in 1697. The book the story was published in was called Tales and Stories of the Past with Morals. Today we usually call it by its subtitle, The Tales of Mother Goose. Unlike the other stories in the book, like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, and Puss in Boots, no one has figured out how to sanitize Bluebeard enough to make it into a popular children's movie. It is the first version to be printed, but like many other stories in his book, it was an existing story that he modernized and added his style to. I don't think he would complain that I did the same for this video to make the story easier to tell, especially considering there are dozens if not hundreds of other versions already. Like many folktales, Bluebeard is believed to have at least been partially inspired by real-life events. The 2 men most commonly believed to have inspired the story both lived in northwestern France, where the story is believed to have originated. Our first inspiration was a man named King Connemore, who is believed to have ruled in modern-day Brittany. He is also called King Connemore the Cursed or King Connemore the Accursed. Connemore is believed to have been born in 460 AD and ruled as the Prince of Poer and later the King of Domnonia. The accounts we do have of Connemore are heavily mixed with folklore, but what seems likely to be true is that Connemore consolidated a large area under his rule by conquest and by marriage. The story says that he acquired Domnonia by killing its king Jonas. He then married Jonas's widow. He treated her and her son well, till she told him about a dream she had. In it, she saw all the kings of Brittany paying homage to her son as he sat on a mountain. Connemore took this as an omen, and began plotting to kill his wife and her son. The 2 of them were able to escape to Paris before he could though. Next, Connemore set his sights on marrying Saint Tryphene. Connemore approached Tryphene's father, King Waroche, asking for her hand in marriage. Her and her father were worried about her marrying Connemore due to his reputation. Fearing that Connemore would invade if they refused, a local monk known as Saint Gildas guaranteed her safety should they marry. Gildas gave her a silver ring to signify this. Things went well at first, but Connemore was paranoid because he had been told that he would be killed by his own son someday. After Tryphene became pregnant, he started plotting her death. The silver ring Saint Gildas gave her then turned black, which she saw as a warning. The next night, she went down to the royal crypt because she had heard there was an escape passage there. Down there, she saw 6 stone coffins, 1 that was empty and 5 that were full. Out of the 5 full coffins came the ghosts of Connemore's 5 previous wives. They came and warned Tryphene of how they were killed. Tryphene then ran into the woods where she saw her father's hawk. She tossed her ring to the hawk, who then brought it to her father. Seeing the ring, her father sent Saint Gildas to save her. In the meantime, Connemore found Tryphene in the woods and cut off her head. The hawk led Saint Gildas to her body, where he began to pray. Triphine's body then sat up and reattached her own head. She went back to her father's castle and gave birth to her and Conomor's son. She named him Tremure. After this, word of Conomor's crimes got out and he was forced out of much of the land he ruled. Years later, Conomor was traveling back through his former lands and he saw a boy. He asked the boy his name and the boy said his name is Tremure. Conomor had heard that this was the name of the son he feared so much. Conomor then pulled out his sword and cut off the boy's head. As Conomor walked away from the lifeless corpse of his son, the corpse stood up and picked up his head. Tremure began taunting and chasing Conomor. He chased him all the way to Conomor's castle, where God then willed the castle to crumble upon Conomor, killing him. You can see how over the course of 1,000+ years this could evolve into the story of Bluebeard. There are quite a few similarities. Conomor is also possibly the inspiration for two other legends. One is King Mark of Cornwall, who appears in the Arthurian legend of Tristan and Iseult. The short summary of that story is that Iseult is to marry Mark, but then she starts cheating on him with Tristan. Mark of Cornwall is often called the Cuckold King for this reason. Like every Arthurian legend, there are quite a few versions of it. I would recommend the 2006 movie Tristan and Iseult. Also, like every Arthurian legend, it's pretty murky who, if anyone, it is based on. Conomor is just one candidate. Conomor may have also been the inspiration for the giant Cormoran, who was the first giant killed in the Jack and the Giant Killer story. Quite the influential fellow King Conomor was, at least as far as literature goes. He did seemingly conquer some land in his day, but not enough for us to have a lot of records on him. Most of what we have comes from him being mentioned in the book of the history of the Franks from 594, and from him appearing in the stories about the lives of the saints he is said to have interacted with. The second possible inspiration has quite a lot more written about him. He was a French noble named Gilles de Rais, who was born around 1405. His parents were from two powerful families, the House of Crayon and the House of Laval. This meant that de Rais was destined to be a wealthy and powerful man, and would become the Baron of Retz. His parents died when de Rais was still young, and he was largely raised by his maternal grandfather, Jean de Crayon. Jean is said to have been a cold man, but he would take de Rais out to the countryside to do pillaging raids on their own people. De Rais would go on to be very successful as a military man. He made a name for himself fighting for France in many conflicts related to the 100 Years' War. This eventually led to him sitting on the royal council for King Charles VII of France. De Rais served as an important general for the French and often fought in the same battles as Joan of Arc, including the sieges of Orleans and Paris. This is where one of the more debated aspects of de Rais' life comes in. There's a lot of speculation as to what Gilles de Rais' relationship was to Joan of Arc. This ranges from people claiming that they didn't know each other to people claiming that they were lovers. They were at least trusted comrades, since it is on record that de Rais was one of the officers she summoned to siege the Parisian gate named Porte Saint-Honoré. De Rais' victories in battle led to him being given the great military honor of Marshal of France. While all of this was happening, de Rais was spending a lot of money. He was building extravagant buildings, commissioning art, and maintaining his own troops. He began selling assets to cover this lifestyle in 1429, which angered his family. After some military losses that angered the king, and the death of his grandfather Jean de Crayon, de Rais began largely staying at his own estates. De Rais continued to sell property to finance his spending. After selling a castle to Geoffrey Le Ferron, the treasurer to the Duke of Brittany, de Rais tried to take it back. This culminated in de Rais kidnapping Geoffrey's brother, Jean Le Ferron, who was a priest. De Rais and a group of armed men went into a mass Jean was officiating and took him and some other officials hostage. He would take them to his castle in Tiffauges. To this day, this castle is sometimes known as Château de Barbe Bleue, or Bluebeard's castle. This was an act of sacrilege, as well as a direct affront to the Duke of Brittany and the Bishop of Nantes, Jean de Malestroit. This led to an ecclesiastical and a civil court investigation into de Rais. The bishop's investigation found many rumors in the lands de Rais ruled over, of him and his servants abducting and sexually abusing children. There were also rumors of him engaging in alchemy and demon summoning. After the investigation, de Rais and several co-conspirators were accused of murdering children, sodomy, invoking demons, offending the divine majesty, and heresy. The two most important accomplices were de Rais' servants, Henriet Griard and Etienne Correlot, also known as Poitou. These two provided the most important testimony in de Rais' trial. There was also an Italian priest named Francois Prelati, who supposedly helped de Rais summon a demon named Baron and tried to use alchemy to make gold to pay off his debts. The rituals used to call the demon were claimed to have included sacrificing children. There was also another priest named Eustache Blanchet, who de Rais often entrusted with his most important affairs. This included recruiting Prelati and bringing him from Italy to de Rais' estate. There aren't a lot of details as to why, but these two priests would go free after the trial. They would later kidnap Geoffrey Le Ferron, as they blamed him for the investigation and trial. The priests would torture Le Ferron for 2 months before he was freed. For this crime, Prelati was burned at the stake and Blanchet was banished and forced to pay compensation to Le Ferron. De Rais' cousins, Gilles de Sille and Roger de Brequeville, were accused of aiding in the killing of children, but they were believed to have gone on the run and they were never captured. The most mythologized supposed accomplices were two women named Téphane Branchou and Perrine Martin, also known as Les Meffrets. Locals said that they were seen talking to children and taking them to the castle, and that the children would not be seen again. They are only mentioned in passing in the original documents, and it is unknown what became of them, and how real they are. De Rais, Henriet, and Poitou did not mention them in their confessions. Also, Henriet and Poitou's confessions are believed to have been made under torture. De Rais was made under threat of torture. Their confessions were the bulk of the evidence and where the details we have come from. It's also where the most obvious influence on Bluebeard's story comes from. They testified that after De Rais had abused and killed the children, they would cut their heads off and keep them in a private room so De Rais could continue admiring them. I'm not going to go into specifics of their actual crimes. They went into great detail of what they did in their testimonies though. Below I linked one of the better sources I found if you want more details from the trial. Several families also came forward to testify that they had entrusted their child to Gilles de Rais and that they were never seen again. The ecclesiastical trial concluded that they had killed at least 140 children. The civil court did not give a specific number. After the trial, De Rais, Henriet, and Poitou were sentenced to death. They were executed simultaneously by being hung over bonfires. After the rope was burned through, De Rais' body was pulled out of the fire and buried at a church in Nantes, which was a condition of his confession. What was left of the other two was left to nature to deal with. And that was the end of Gilles de Rais' story. Except that some people think what I just told you might not be true. All the way back to the actual time of the trial, there have been questions about its validity. There are two main reasons for this. First is that most of the evidence came from confessions extracted by torture, with little to no physical evidence. The other big reason is that there were political motives for Gilles de Rais to go away. After his death, the Duke of Brittany was able to seize de Rais' assets. The trial was also abnormally quick, possibly to avoid Charles VII from interfering. A few years after the trial, Charles even wrote a letter saying that the trial was politically motivated when trying to give de Rais' property back to his widow. De Rais' innocence was never proven though. Since then, many have questioned his guilt, ranging from Voltaire to Aleister Crowley to modern medievalists. I would agree with the larger consensus, however. Although there are questions about some of the testimony, there was enough to think that Gilles de Rais was more than likely a serial killer before the term existed. The number of how many he killed ranges from dozens to 600, and I don't think we'll ever be confident on what the true number is. I would also agree with some that say that he may have never been caught if he hadn't run afoul of the Duke of Brittany. It was fairly rare for nobles to actually face any sort of real punishment for what they did to commoners. It also seems likely that the Duke pushed for a speedy trial. For better or for worse, what is definitely true is that Gilles de Rais has impacted culture beyond being an inspiration for Bluebeard. He has appeared in numerous works of art and will likely be continued to be talked about long after we are dead. That is all I have for you. I hope you have a great day and eat something good.